Chapter 2130. After Zhizhuang Daoren said this, he saw that the Taoist didn't say anything, so he knew that the Taoist was moved. So he stood up and said, "That being has now taken back an avatar, and he is more powerful than before. How can you be his opponent? Maybe he is waiting for you there. If you don't plan as soon as possible, I'm afraid that he will take it back. Then it will be too late to regret." The Taoist didn't say yes or no. He just shook his body and disappeared. Seeing that the Taoist left, Zhizhuang Daoren immediately calculated. Although there was no result, there was no bad omen either. At this moment, a familiar divine will came to him, and he accepted it. The owner of this divine will was Taoist Rendu. After he disappeared, he bowed and said, "Just now, I have sensed the location of a fragment of good fortune, but before I could find it, I was disturbed by Taoist Yuan Xian, and even the fragment of good fortune was taken by Taoist Yuan Xian." Zhizhuang Daoren was looking for the essence of good fortune to attract the avatar of that being. Now that the being had come to him twice, it seemed that it was very likely that he would come to the Mirror Lake for shelter, so it was meaningless to find the essence of good fortune. So he comforted him with kind words, "I have seen it with my own eyes. It is not your fault. You can continue to look for it, and I will find a way to suppress it." Taoist Rendu knew that Zhizhuang took this matter very seriously, and he only came to give an explanation. Seeing that Zhizhuang didn't look into it, he was a little surprised. He didn't know what Zhizhuang was thinking, but he thought it was a good thing. After bowing, he left. After he left, Zhizhuang Daoren realized that he had neglected one thing. If he didn't react to this at all, Zhang Yan would probably notice something, especially since he had come into contact with that existence's divine clone twice in a row. Even though it was only an incarnation of qi activity, it was possible that it would be sensed. After thinking about it, he decided to ask Ancestor Yao Han to join in the search for the essence of good fortune. If he did anything and took the essence of good fortune for himself, then Zhang Yan would most likely notice and stop him. This would only cause conflict between the two, but it wouldn't hurt him. Thinking about this, he waved his sleeve and sent out an invitation. Ancestor Yao Han quickly received the invitation. Seeing that it wanted him to use his mana to search for the essence of good fortune, he couldn't help but be surprised. Zhizhuang Daoren had been guarding against him, and now he wanted him to act. Was it because the good fortune fragment was taken by Zhang Yan just now, so he had no choice but to ask him to join? His gaze flickered. Things were definitely not that simple. Although Taoist Zhizhuang had invited him in name, in reality, he could not disobey. Hence, before they had a falling out, he had to do this. Hence, he put down the letter. With a thought, he released his mana. Zhizhuang Daoren didn't care about anything else and just stared at the void. He had a feeling that the avatar would arrive soon. Sure enough, in less than half a year, the aura of the Taoist appeared in front of him again. Taoist Zhizhuang cupped his hands and said in a serious tone, "Have you thought it through?" The Taoist was silent for a while before saying, "I don't believe you. If it wasn't for your strong desire, I wouldn't have come here." Zhizhuang Daoren suddenly understood. He didn't know how this person knew that he was looking for the person. He said, "Don't worry, I wasn't lying." The Taoist said expressionlessly, "I hope so." In fact, he still didn't believe Zhizhuang. However, he knew that even if Zhizhuang tricked him into coming here and suppressed him, he wouldn't do anything to him. Instead, he would try his best to prevent him from being devoured by the original master. Zhizhuang Daoren seemed to have thought of something and said, "If you want to come here, you need to be careful. That Taoist Xian Yuan is adamant about this. If you are discovered by this person, I'm afraid there will be changes." The mighty force that Zhang Yan revealed when dealing with Taoist Rendu had caused his heart to palpitate, and he was deeply afraid that this matter would be hindered as well. That was why he spoke out to warn Qin Shi. The Taoist showed a rare look of caution and said, "I know this person, but you need to be careful." He was slashed out by Zhang Yan and the sword-wielding Taoist. Even before his primordial lord's soul recovered, he didn't dare to fight against these two. Naturally, he didn't dare either. He looked at Ji Zhuang and said, "In order to avoid any unforeseen events, I will first place a strand of qi dynamic in your world. When my Dharmakaya comes, I will need to borrow your divine will and use it to sneak in. I wonder if you are willing." After Sima Quan entered the surging wave, he followed it and swam away. The water was filled with turbid air. When he fell into it, his Fa Li was not damaged. There was no sun or moon outside, so it was hard to tell how much time had passed. He could only count in his heart. After counting for about 129,600, he felt a strange change outside his body. The water actually slowly descended, and his entire body was revealed from within. Before him was a boundless jade wall that lay before him, and it was covered in countless carvings. From mountains, rivers, land, to birds, beasts, flowers, and plants, there was everything one could think of. He sensed it and found that it didn't seem like it was the end. The water below him didn't stop and continued to rush forward. When it reached the wall, it seemed to turn into nothingness and went straight through. He walked forward on the water, and after a while, he heard countless sounds. He saw that the birds, beasts, fish, and insects that were carved on the jade discs were actually swimming around, and there were sounds of waves being chiseled and wings flapping. However, these stone carvings were not exquisite, and were only simple and rough outlines, which looked extremely strange. After looking for a while, he saw a boat carved from stone slowly approaching from afar. There was a person in Taoist robes standing on it. As the waves formed by simple curves were separated, they finally came close. Sima Quan saw that the person only had a side profile. However, his clothes were loose and his hair was tied up in a Taoist bun. As only half of his body could be seen, only one eye was facing him. The person turned his body and bowed. He said in a mellow voice that sounded like a living person, "Quickly get on the boat, quickly get on the boat." Sima Quan returned the bow and asked, "Where is the boat going?" The person said, "Since you've entered the serene water, don't ask where it's going. Get on my boat and you'll be free." As he spoke, his head shook stiffly, showing a sense of pride. Sima Quan looked at the big jade wall. There were countless living beings in it. They seemed to be full of life and prosperity. However, to him, it was boring and dry. There was no sense of freedom at all. He said, "I'm different from all of you." The eyeballs on the person's head moved and asked in confusion, "What's the difference?" "You're still the same as me." When Sima Quan heard his words, he seemed to be deep in thought. He said, "I'm afraid the scenery here is different from what you've seen. Why don't you get off the boat and take a look? Perhaps you'll see a different scenery." The person stretched out his hand and waved it. He said, No, the Ming water is not where I live." Sima Quan said seriously, "The place you're at is also not where I should go." The person sighed, as if it was a pity that he had missed something. Then, he waved his big sleeve and slowly retreated along the lines of the waves. Not long after the person retreated, the big jade wall also quietly disappeared. It was as if it had never appeared here just now. Sima Quan, on the other hand, allowed the water under his feet to rise up and cover him again. He continued to rush forward. Not long after, the water receded again. What appeared in front of him was a huge glazed golden pot whose outline was difficult to see. It was standing upside down, and a portion of the raging river water was pouring into the pot's mouth. There were countless golden lines on the pot, like vines twining around branches, leaves, and vines. Each of the vines had a headless little person embedded with gold foil and jade pieces. All of the little people were clapping and dancing there, but not a single sound came out. He only stared at it for a moment before the golden glazed pot shook with a loud bang and turned into countless tiny glazed jade sand that poured down from above and sprinkled on the muddy river beneath his feet, forming a pool on the shore. In the glazed jade sand, there was a Taoist with a jade hairpin in his hair sitting there. He had a handsome face and a peaceful expression. However, there was not a single trace of a human's aura on him. He opened his eyes and smiled at Sima Quan. He said, "Fellow Taoist, you're here. Why don't you sit in front and talk?" Sima Quan walked to the front and bowed solemnly. He said, Sima Quan of the Netherworld Spring Sect greets fellow Taoist. He then sat down and cupped his hands. May I ask fellow Taoist's name? The Taoist smiled and said, I'm Glazed Konka, a servant of the Patriarch. I've been ordered by the Patriarch to guard this chaotic realm. Since fellow Taoist has come here, I can finally be free. Sima Quan looked at him again and couldn't help but have a guess in his heart. He had done many things under Zhang Yan and had seen many things. This person should be the transformation of the glazed golden kettle, a magic treasure true spirit. However, with his magic power, he couldn't see what level the other party had reached. He said, Why do you say so, fellow Taoist? The glazed Konka smiled and stretched out his hand. Fellow Taoist, can you let me take a look at your seal? Sima Quan reached into his sleeve and took out the sect master seal given by Yuan Hongyang and handed it to the other party. The glazed Konka took it and looked at it. He nodded and said, With this seal, you can prove that you're a disciple of the Netherworld Spring sect passed down by the Patriarch. The 3 sects passed down by the Patriarch all landed in different heaven regions. You're the first person from the Netherworld Spring sect to land here. According to the Patriarch's instructions, this place should be under your control. Sima Quan was slightly surprised. He said, According to Sima's knowledge, the ancestors of the Netherworld Spring sect also ascended to this place. Could it be that they're not here? The glazed Konka smiled and said, They came with the Patriarch's seal, so they naturally have a place to go. They didn't stay here. Sima Quan said, Then Sima wants to pay a visit to Senior Taoist. Where should I find him? The glazed Konka cupped his hands and said, I don't know either. After your sect takes control of this world, you might know the answer. Chapter 2131. Sima Quan listened to the glazed Konka's explanation and thought for a while before saying, I've come here with the talisman bestowed upon me by the sect leader. The one who holds this talisman is like the sect leader himself. I'd like to ask you, what should I do to control this realm? The glazed Konka smiled and said, Although you have the talisman, it's still not enough. Sima Quan asked doubtfully, What else is missing? The glazed Konka said, The technique you cultivate is not personally taught by the sect leader Mingquan, so it can't be used here. Therefore, you can't do it yet. Sima Quan immediately understood that other than the sect leader Mingquan, it would be useless for anyone to come here. He couldn't help but feel a little regretful. It seemed that he couldn't occupy the celestial sphere now. He asked again, I heard you say that the Patriarch still has 2 lineages of inheritance. May I know where they are now? The glazed Konka said, I'm just a guard. I don't know where the Patriarch's descendants and disciples are. Even if you're here, I don't know where you're from. Sima Quan saw that he couldn't get anything out of the glazed Konka, so he brought up another matter and said, Before I came here, I was entrusted by a Taisheng to ask me about something. Taisheng? The glazed Konka couldn't help but look surprised and said, There's actually such a powerful person in the realm of your sect? His expression became serious. I wonder what the person wants to ask. Sima Quan said, The words of the Taisheng are obscure and mysterious. Sima's cultivation is shallow, so I can't explain it to you. Please take a look at this. He raised his sleeve and took out the golden talisman. The glazed Konka only took a glance at it and felt a huge whaley shroud him in an instant. He was so shocked that he didn't dare to move. Then, a thought was transmitted to his consciousness. After the power retreated, he still had a lingering fear. He thought for a while and carefully replied, As far as I know, the realm that the Taisheng mentioned does indeed exist. However, I don't know where it is. The Patriarch once said that if the disciples of the younger generation are fated, they can go there. Sima Quan nodded, kept the golden talisman and said, Sima understands, I will report this to the Grand Elder when I return. Seeing that he was no longer talking about the Grand Supreme behind him, the Lukong guest felt relieved and said, The river of spirits was left behind by the founding master. There are many mysteries hidden here that even I can't understand. Moreover, there is no end to it. Why don't fellow Taoists stay here for a few more days and float along the river to see if you can find any opportunities? However, he didn't intend to stay for long. Although the turbid energy and spiritual energy in this place seemed boundless, the mountain and sea realm wasn't that bad either. As for the laws of fate, just the method of returning to the mortal world that he had obtained before was enough for him to study. It was meaningless to obtain more. Moreover, from what Lukang had said, if the descendants of the other two branches of the patriarch came here, then this chaos heaven might fall into their hands. If it was an ordinary realm, he wouldn't care. But now, the sects of the 9 continents were expanding everywhere, and the Netherworld Spring sect was doing the same. Who knew how much land they occupied? But this place was especially different. Not only was it left behind by the founding master, but the people who had ascended could also go to other places through this place. Therefore, they had to take control of this place to find those predecessors. Perhaps they could even find a better method there. Moreover, there were great benefits here. He had seen true yang cultivators before, so he guessed that this Lukang guest must be a Taoist treasure. Perhaps only by occupying this realm would he be able to serve him. Although Yuan Hongyang was in secluded cultivation and wouldn't come out for many years, and none of his personal disciples had reached the mortal transformation realm, he could try to ask his doppelgangers to come here. If one wanted to achieve true yang, they couldn't leak any magic power outside. For example, after Qin Mabai and Yu Xianshao went into secluded cultivation, they didn't have any doppelgangers or magic power outside. However, the Netherworld Spring sect was different. Not only did they have many doppelgangers, but they wouldn't increase their magic power even if they called them back. Therefore, even if Yuan Hongyang went into secluded cultivation, he still had one outside in case of emergencies. Therefore, he said, the Grand Elder and the sect are waiting for Sima to go back and report, so it's not convenient for me to stay here any longer. The Lukang guest tried to persuade him to stay a few more times, but seeing that he was determined, he didn't say anything more. He picked up a colored glass and a porcelain cup, scooped up the water from the long river below, and threw the colored glass into the cup. Then, he handed the jade cup over and said, since you are going to leave, why don't you take these 2 items back with you? They will be useful in the future. Sima Quan didn't refuse. He took the cup and put it away. Then, he bowed to the Lukang guest and left. After leaving Hun Tian, he first used the power of the golden talisman to go to Qinghuan Palace. Above the mirror lake, the Taoist was quietly waiting for Jizhuang Doran's reply. It was an extremely dangerous thing to use the divine will, especially for an existence like him who had the ability to devour everything. As long as he successfully entered the divine will of others, he would be able to devour it in an instant. Even if the mighty figure of the spirit refinement realm wouldn't die because of this, he would be forced into eternal silence. However, this was also the safest way to cross into the mirror lake. This way, he could bypass any external resistance. Unless the person who intervened could discover this in an instant, and there was an external force to break the mirror lake and force Ji Zhuang into eternal silence at the same time, no one would be able to do this. Even if that existence was at his peak, he wouldn't be able to do this. When Jizhuang Daoren heard that he wanted to use the divine will, he didn't hesitate at all. With an extremely sincere attitude, he said, if you think this method is useful, then please use it. When the time comes, you only need to send a message, and I can use the divine will to cross over. The Taoist couldn't help but feel a little surprised. His words were indeed meant to test Ji Zhuang, but he didn't expect Ji Zhuang to agree so readily. He took a deep look at the Taoist, and his figure slowly faded away. He still didn't leave any words before he left. Jizhuang Daoren, however, knew that the matter was almost done, especially when he used the divine will to cross over. This in itself was a bait that was hard to refuse, and the decision was in the hands of the other party. From the perspective of the Taoist, even if he really didn't want to enter the mirror lake, he could still devour Ji Zhuang. This time, he didn't wait for long. Suddenly, he felt an external divine will coming. The qi dynamic was full of invasion, but he wasn't surprised. Instead, he was happy. He immediately let go of the divine will and allowed it to cross over. In an unknown place, the Taoist appeared again and said, "The Yuan Lord is chasing me closely, and I have no way out. I can only hide in your territory. If he comes after me, I won't help you fight against him." Zhizhuang Daoren said, "Don't worry, Taoist friend. You don't need to show up. My mirror lake can maintain its stability." He knew very well that before that existence recovered his strength, he would not dare to recklessly attack the mirror lake. Otherwise, he would definitely be stopped by the combined forces of the sword-wielding Daoist and Zhang Yan, so he spoke with great confidence. Seeing that Ji Zhuang agreed, the Taoist's body suddenly scattered and instantly merged into Ji Zhuang's divine will. Zhizhuang Daoren was slightly stunned. Normally, if the existence wanted to do something to him, he wouldn't be able to resist. However, he dared to do so not because he trusted the existence completely, but because he had the confidence to do so. With the protection of the person in the mirror, he wasn't afraid that the divine will could do anything to him. However, he also didn't want things to go to this point because it didn't fit his plan. Fortunately, the existence didn't do that. With a turn of the divine will, the Taoist appeared in the hall out of thin air. He waved his sleeves and walked around the hall. His eyes flickered and he said, "Is this the place of creation?" The existence had devoured many creation essences and countless realms, but he had never devoured the real place of creation. If he could seize this place and turn it into his own resources, his strength would definitely increase greatly. He might not be weaker than the Yuan Lord God, and he might even have a chance to devour it. When he thought up to here, his heart started to itch, but he quickly suppressed it. This idea was very tempting, but if he really wanted to do that, he would try to invade Ji Zhuang's divine will just now instead of entering directly. It wasn't that he wasn't confident, but it was impossible for him to devour the whole place of creation in an instant. There were other spirit refinement cultivators in the Mirror Lake, and his current strength wasn't much stronger than them. If they joined forces, they still had the ability to suppress him. After looking for a while, he suddenly realized that although his senses weren't blocked, there was clearly a circle of restriction around him, and he couldn't get out of this place. He asked coldly, "What is the meaning of this?" Zhizhuang Daoren said, "Fellow Taoist, please don't misunderstand. The other Taoists don't agree with me guiding you into the Mirror Lake. Therefore, this barrier is to block off their senses to prevent any accidents." He did this behind Yahan and the others' backs. If he didn't block off the surroundings, these people would know immediately. If they all opposed this, even if he was the master, he wouldn't be able to get away with it. Most importantly, Zhang Yan was outside, so he didn't dare to take the risk. The Taoist said, "You won't be able to hide it for long." Zhizhuang Daoren nodded. Although he did this secretly and no one noticed it, the other Taoists would be able to sense things that were not beneficial to them. Therefore, this matter would be discovered sooner or later. However, he thought he could drag it out as long as he could. If he was discovered after everything was done, then this divine avatar would lose its value, and it wouldn't be too late to deal with it then. He said, "As long as fellow Taoist cooperates, I can still hide it." The Taoist didn't say much, but asked, "What exactly are you looking for when you asked me to come here?" This was the third time he asked about this. Zhizhuang Daoren thought for a while and reached out his hand. A ball of golden light slowly bloomed, and it was obvious that there was a shadow of Pauline in it. "This is," the Taoist stared at it for a moment. He felt that this thing was very familiar, but he couldn't tell the specific reason. "Is this what you want me to look for?" Zhizhuang Daoren said solemnly, "That's right." The Taoist thought for a while and said, "I will try to look for it, but I can't say for sure that I will be able to find it." Zhizhuang Daoren bowed and said, "Then I will leave it to fellow Taoist." He believed that the Taoist would slowly remember this thing in the process of looking for it. At that time, even if he didn't remind him, he would definitely try his best to look for it. This was because this thing was extremely useful to him. After obtaining this thing, he wouldn't have to be afraid of the original Master God anymore. Chapter 2132. The moment Zhizhuang Daoren led the avatar into the Mirror Lake, the spirit refinement cultivators in the lake felt that something was wrong. It was as if there was a strong sense of danger around them. However, this feeling came and went, making it difficult for them to make a judgment. Patriarch Yahan was suspicious when Ji Zhuang asked him to find the essence of creation. However, he couldn't figure out Ji Zhuang's true intentions. Now that this feeling appeared, he immediately guessed that this matter had something to do with Ji Zhuang. He tried to calculate, but he found that the mysteries of heaven were unclear and he couldn't figure it out. He suspected that this matter had something to do with the avatar. However, he didn't know that the avatar had already entered the mirror lake. He just thought that Jizhuang Daoren might have come into contact with it. In fact, as long as the avatar had come into contact, it wouldn't be long before the avatar entered the realm. This was because the avatar was constantly being chased by the original master's god. If it found a realm that was used for protection, even if it was likely to be suppressed, it would still choose to enter. Patriarch Yahan pondered for a long time. In fact, he was happy to see Jizhuang Daoren do this. This way, he could incite the other people in the realm and find a way to replace Jizhuang Daoren. However, Jizhuang was the master of the land of creation and naturally had a great advantage in the mirror lake. If Zhang Yan didn't make a move, there was nothing he could do. He thought to himself, I can only wait for now. He believed that Zhang Yan would definitely feel this. Even if he didn't make a move this time, as long as Jizhuang Daoren continued down this path, a conflict would eventually break out between the two. In the Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan suddenly opened his eyes. The fear in his heart grew stronger and stronger. He looked at the mirror lake. The problem must be there. He thought of a possibility. Perhaps Jizhuang had already drawn the avatar into the mirror lake. If that was the case, there was no way to stop it. The worst-case scenario was that the divine clone would devour the land of creation and turn around to fight with the primordial master god. Then, an even more powerful existence would appear. He was prepared for this. Now that he had both qi and strength, even if that existence appeared again, he would have to fight it. Moreover, at that time, he would not be fighting alone. The Taoist with the sword would definitely appear, and he would have a good chance of winning. However, Ji Zhuang's plan was still unfathomable. He said that he had invited the avatar into the mirror lake to suppress it to delay the return of that existence. This was clearly just an excuse. There was no doubt that there was a greater scheme behind it. There was a flash of light in the palace and the array spirit came out. It bowed and reported, Master, Si Bianjin is back, should we call him here? Zhang Yan nodded and said, invite him into the hall to talk. Not long after, Sima Quan walked into the main hall and said, Greetings, Palace Master Zhang. Zhang Yan nodded and returned the greeting. He smiled and said, how was your trip, fellow Sima? If it was an ordinary world, then his consciousness would naturally be able to understand everything. However, the Nether Spring Sect's world was similar to the Eternal Sky Muddy Sky, and it was similarly concealed by the mighty energy of founding ancestor Ling Yu. If he didn't intentionally investigate it, then he would be unable to know the exact situation within it. Sima Quan immediately explained what had happened and said, the fellow Taoist guarding this realm said that the place that the Grand Supreme is looking for doesn't exist. However, the Grand Master said that those who are fated can go there. Zhang Yan made a slight deduction when he heard these words, yet he encountered a layer of mist as well. He knew that there was a place where the essence of creation was hidden behind this chaotic sky, and founding ancestor Ling Yu ought to have made appropriate arrangements for this. Since it was like that, then there was no need for him to interfere. However, he did not care about the place of creation, but this muddy heaven had to be fixed in Buxu heaven, including the Weili. Otherwise, it would hinder his control of Buxu heaven. Sima Quan said, according to the fellow Taoist guarding this realm, no matter which line of Grandmaster's direct disciple comes here, they can take control of this realm. Therefore, Sima Quan needs to return to the sect and invite the sect master's clone to see if this can be done. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. The Netherworld Spring sect was a sect in the 9 continents. It would be best for this sect to occupy Muddy Heaven. Although the other two lines of Grandmaster Ling Yu's disciples had never been to Muddy Heaven before, now that the spiritual opportunity was flourishing, many things that were impossible in the past became possible. He could help the Netherworld Spring sect here, so he said, "Do you have the golden talisman that I gave to you?" Sima Quan quickly took it out and said, "The talisman is here." Zhang Yan pointed with his finger, and the golden talisman flashed. He said, "You can pass this talisman to Sect Master Yuan." Sima Quan hurriedly thanked him and kept the golden talisman. He bowed and said, "Sima Quan will take his leave first." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Go ahead, fellow Taoist." Not long after Sima Quan left, Shen Chang, Qing Sheng, and the others all sent their divine wills to him. They also felt that something was wrong, so they came to ask him. He answered them one by one, saying that this matter was related to Zhizhuang Doran's plan. However, they had no way of knowing what was going on. There was not much they could do, so they could only wait. In the Mirror Lake, after Zhizhuang Daoran left, the more the Daoist thought about it, the more familiar he felt that this item was. He even felt that this item could make up for what he was missing. He knew that after he found that item, he would no longer have any use for it. At that time, Zhizhuang Daoran would very likely turn against him and suppress him. However, at the same time, he thought that once he obtained this item, his strength would undoubtedly increase greatly. He might even be able to swallow this land of creation and Zhizhuang Daoran together. At that time, the original God of Masters would no longer be his opponent, and he could turn the original God of Masters into his own body. With this thought, he concentrated his mind into the silence and began to search seriously. He was different from other cultivators. If he released his mana, he would definitely swallow everything. However, his chi could roam anywhere he wanted, and no one would be able to detect it. This was the case when he had communicated with Zhizhuang Daoran previously. The only one who could discover his traces here was the original God of Masters. However, according to what Zhizhuang Daoran said, the original God of Masters might not dare to show himself now, so he could ignore it for the time being. Zhizhuang Daoran left the main hall and came to the Supreme Altar. He bowed to it, and after a while, a jade mirror appeared in the void. His appearance appeared in the mirror, but he looked at him indifferently without any expression. He cupped his hands and said, "I have already invited that existence's divine clone into my mirror lake. The matter is already half done. You can come back as soon as I find that item." However, there is no one around me to respond. Instead, there are many people with bad intentions. I am really afraid that there is something difficult to deal with. Speaking until here, he seemed to have heard something and revealed a focused look. After a long time, he nodded and said, "If the situation is urgent, we can only try this method." The figure in the mirror gradually dimmed, and the big mirror also disappeared into the void in the blink of an eye. On the other hand, Zhizhuang Daoran stood on the stage and pondered silently. The person in the mirror suggested that he use a Dao technique called Yuan Source Technique. This technique could bypass all difficulties and directly obtain the result as long as the person using the technique had great confidence in succeeding. The most powerful thing was that this technique could be directly used on the same generation as the refined spirit. In short, if the divine clone could use this technique, as long as everything went smoothly, then the location of the item would be known in an instant. However, there were many harsh conditions. Firstly, this technique could only be used once. If it failed, it could never be used again. Secondly, the person using the technique had to be almost 100% confident in the result. Otherwise, not only would he not get anything, but he might even experience some unpredictable changes. There was even a small chance that he would voluntarily enter the void. He knew a little about this technique before. If not for the various restrictions, he would have used this technique to find the divine clone long ago. However, what made him hesitate was another requirement. To use this technique, he needed to use the creation Weili. Currently, the situation was still under his control, but if he took the initiative to send the creation power to the divine clone, he was afraid that things would go out of control. Logically speaking, he did not need to be so anxious. However, if this matter was dragged on, the variables would increase. Not to mention the great pressure brought by Bushutian. Once the people in the Mirror Lake knew the real situation here, they would immediately rebel. After weighing the pros and cons for a long time, he finally made up his mind. With a change of heart, he once again came to the hall. When the Taoist saw him, he only glanced at him and did not pay much attention to him. He was still looking at the void, searching for the location of the item. Jizhuang Daoren came up and cupped his hands. "I have something to discuss with you." The Taoist said, "What is it?" Jizhuang Daoren said, "I know a Dao technique that can help you find the item as soon as possible." The Taoist paused and raised his head. "What method?" Jizhuang Daoren immediately used his divine will to demonstrate the origin source technique to him. When the Taoist heard that he needed the help of the creation Weili, he felt that it would be very useful to him. However, he still had some doubts in his heart. Since this technique is so useful, there must be a limit. Jizhuang Daoren said, "As you said, this technique has its pros and cons, so it is suitable to be used in times of crisis." The Taoist immediately understood what he meant. This meant that before there was a problem in the Mirror Lake, he could slowly search for the item. However, if there was a problem, he could use this Dao technique, and if he was lucky, he could immediately reach his goal. He sneered and said, "Why wait until then?" Taoist Jizhuang looked over in shock and said, "Fellow Taoist, you mean," the Taoist said, "since there is such a Dao technique, why delay? I am confident that I can find the item, so this Dao technique is suitable." After entering the Mirror Lake, he secretly calculated and observed for a while. He more or less understood the situation here. Just like what Jizhuang said, most of the people in the Mirror Lake had different opinions. Therefore, he thought that he would not be able to hide his whereabouts for long. At that time, Jizhuang Daoren would obviously be besieged by many of his peers. Then, he would not be safe here. Instead of rushing things, it was better to act as soon as possible. He stared at Jizhuang Daoren and said bluntly, "Please lend me the creation Weili immediately." Chapter 2133. Jizhuang Daoren calculated in his mind. If this matter could be resolved quickly, it would be beneficial to him. Even though lending a little of the creation Weili was risky, it was not impossible to guard against it. The most important thing was that the other party obviously did not see the true mystery of the art of origin. He said, "Wait a moment. Using the creation Weili will cause too much of a commotion. I need to inform my fellow Taoists to prevent any misunderstandings, which will be detrimental to our actions." The Taoist glanced at him and knew that he needed to prepare an escape route in order to guard against him. He said, "Then hurry up." Jizhuang Daoren bowed to him and spread the word to everyone that he was going to use a Taoist technique and needed to borrow the creation Weili. He told everyone to settle down. At this time, he sent his doppelganger to the Taoist throne to meet the person in the mirror. Only then did he return to his senses and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist, please get ready. I will send the creation Weili to you." The Taoist said coldly, "There is no need to say these unnecessary words." Jizhuang Daoren did not care about his attitude. With a thought, he immediately attracted the creation Weili and sent it to the Taoist's divine will. As soon as the Taoist felt the Weili enter his body, his eyes lit up. He had an urge to swallow this power and make it his own. However, it was meaningless to do so. At most, it would only increase his power a little. Moreover, he knew that Jizhuang could cut off this Weili with a thought. If he could find that thing, the entire Mirror Lake could become his resource. Therefore, he forcibly suppressed his greed and started to use the art of origin. Jizhuang Daoren used the creation Weili. This was originally the master's business. However, he did it for no reason, especially when everyone had a bad feeling about it. It was especially suspicious. Taoist Rendu was the first to lose his patience. He said to Taoist Sky Reaching, "Fellow Taoist, I wonder what Jizhuang is going to do. Will he harm us?" Taoist Sky Reaching couldn't make a decision. After all, Jizhuang was the master. If he really did harm to them, they might not even be able to escape. Although the possibility was very small, they could not be careless just in case. He thought for a moment and went to Taoist Xian Che. He said, "Fellow Taoist, is it convenient for you to speak?" Taoist Xian Che replied, "What is it, fellow Taoist?" Taoist Towering Sky said, "Why do you ask when you already know the answer?" That Ji Zhuang suddenly used the mighty force of creation, saying that he wanted to use a Taoist art, but who knows what his goal is. It would be best if there is nothing, but if there is. He, fellow Taoist, why don't you join hands with us? We don't need to do anything, just protect ourselves. Taoist Xian Che was also doubtful about the feeling from before. Towering Sky's request wasn't excessive, and judging from the current situation, there was no better way than this. He said, "This humble Taoist agrees with fellow Taoist." Apart from them, Patriarch Yahan had also made preparations in secret. However, he didn't think that they were going to attack the people of the realm. Instead, he deduced that they might have come into contact with the divine clone and were going to bring it into the realm. He was afraid that Zhang Yan would come to disturb them or even attack the Mirror Lake, so he made some preparations first. Once the origin source art was completed, the caster would be able to obtain what they wanted in an instant. However, the art itself wasn't something that could be completed in one go. It required a sufficient amount of creation Whaley to be poured in, and once it started, it couldn't be stopped. Otherwise, not only would the caster fail, but the consequences wouldn't be reduced in the slightest. After the Taoist entered the art, he felt his body sink. It was as if he had fallen from the land of creation into the silence of the void. In his senses, everything was originally a jumbled mess. It was like a huge dye vat that was extremely messy. However, what appeared in front of him now was a well-organized and rich variety of things. In the blink of an eye, the Dharma ripples of countless cultivators from the main world and spirit refinement realm started to recede. Only a few things were still clearly present. This situation was like a receding tide, exposing the sand and stones at the bottom of a river. However, he also discovered that there were far more things here that he had never seen before. It was just that he had devoured everything in one go in the past, so he did not distinguish between them. As he continued to advance the art, these things were stripped away layer by layer. His own consciousness also gradually moved towards the final location of those things. However, it felt like the process was longer than he had imagined. In the beginning, he still had the heart to look at the things that were being stripped away layer by layer. However, he wasn't a cultivator after all. He only needed to devour things to improve himself. There was no need for him to comprehend the mysteries of the great Tao. Thus, he quickly lost interest in these things. He only carefully maintained the Tao art and waited for the final result to appear. He only felt that the things in front of him were being stripped away faster and faster. In the end, it finally slowed down, as if everything had stopped. Even he couldn't tell if what he was seeing was beyond his level and he could no longer observe it, or if it had really stopped. And at this moment, a golden light suddenly appeared, blooming into the surroundings with an infinite glaze color. His spirit was greatly lifted as he stared at it. Soon, the shadow of a lotus was reflected in his divine will. At this moment, he could already see it very clearly. This thing seemed to be still and yet it was moving. It seemed to be spinning and yet it was impossible to distinguish the number of petals. It really is this thing. The moment he saw this thing, he inexplicably knew its origin. This thing could be called Creation Pauline. Back then, the Vedantas each had one, but no one knew how this thing came about. Perhaps those Vedantas became Vedantas because they had this thing, or perhaps it was the Vedantas themselves. And after the creation essence was broken, there was Pauline scattered in the void. It was still difficult to confirm whether these Pauline were originally held by those Vedantas or were reborn. But no matter what, as long as he obtained this thing, Ji Zhuang and the others could suppress him easily. Even if he could borrow the creation Whaley, he would still be no match for him. Most importantly, after obtaining the power of Pauline, he would no longer need to fear the original god of masters. He tried to attach his consciousness to it, but he immediately realized that he could not do such a thing. With a thought, he understood that he was merely looking at this thing, but in reality, they were still separated from each other. It was just like a mortal looking at a strange object in a painting. He could only admire it, but could not take it out. The reason for this should be that the Yuan source technique had not been fully activated, and there was still a need for more creation Weili. Thus, he said to Jizhuang Daoren, "I need more Weili." Jizhuang Daoren looked at him deeply, and with a silent movement, he mobilized more Weili and delivered it to the transportation envoy. With the support of an endless stream of Weili, the Taoist could gradually feel that the barrier between him and that thing was disappearing, but he became very careful. He could feel that there was only one chance to obtain this Pauline. If he missed it, he would never be able to reach this place again. When the obstruction completely disappeared, he attached his consciousness to it without the slightest hesitation, intending to seize it for himself. He had never thought of giving this thing to Jizhuang Daoren. This was not considered a violation of his previous promise. He had promised Jizhuang that he would only be responsible for finding this thing. As for what would happen after that, there had never been any agreement. However, just now, when he moved his consciousness towards Pauline, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. He realized that he was gradually moving away from Pauline. This was because the creation Weili that was supposed to be delivered to him was weakening. He immediately realized that perhaps Jizhuang Daoren had sensed his actions. Moreover, he realized that he had not completely retreated from this place. At this moment, as if he had sensed something, he suddenly turned around and saw that Jizhuang Daoren had appeared behind him. Jizhuang smiled faintly and said, "Do you know why I asked you to find this thing, but I didn't ask you to take it out? This is because I only need you to point out the location of this treasure. As for coming down, I can do it myself." As he spoke, he had already floated towards Pauline. The Taoist watched as the person's figure disappeared into Pauline. In the next moment, he felt an endless Weili surging towards him. With a loud bang, he was forced out of the divine will in a trance. His eyes sharpened and the mana in his body gathered. However, before he could do anything, countless restrictions in the hall suddenly surged and wrapped around him, forcefully suppressing him. Just as he was about to move again, he stopped. Jizhuang Daoren also withdrew from the divine will. At this moment, he was looking at him with a faint smile. Then, he raised his palm and a golden lotus appeared on it. He sighed and said, "If just now, fellow Taoist, can you stop being greedy? Maybe I can treat fellow Taoist well when I come down, and we won't have to be so hostile toward each other." The Taoist snorted. Although this matter did not succeed and he was a little unwilling, what could Jizhuang Daoren do to him? He was only a divine clone of that existence. If he were to perish because of this, he would not return to eternal silence. He would only return to the original God of God. Therefore, the worst outcome would be to suppress him. After looking at Pauline for a moment, Jizhuang Daoren flicked his sleeves. In an instant, the surrounding scene changed. The Taoist suddenly realized that he had been moved out of the hall and arrived on a throne. The surroundings were empty and there was nothing around him. At this moment, Jizhuang Daoren walked up to the highest point and bowed to the throne. In front of him, smoke gathered and a jade mirror appeared from nothingness. After a moment, a figure seemed to come from afar. His expression was indifferent and his appearance was exactly the same as Jizhuang Daoren. Jizhuang Daoren said respectfully, "Fellow Taoist, creation Pauline has been found." He lifted Pauline up and bowed to the jade mirror again. He said, "Please return, fellow Taoist." In the mirror, Jizhuang glanced at Pauline and saw her floating up and submerging into the jade mirror. Then, she took a step forward and walked out of the jade mirror. Chapter 2134. After the person in the mirror stepped out, Jizhuang Daoren also walked up. A white light shone on both of them at the same time. Then, in the eyes of the Taoist, they merged into one person. When the Taoist saw this scene, he was shocked and surprised. He tried to identify the qi dynamic and found that it was deep and unparalleled. It was very similar to the image of the great virtue in his memory. When he thought of this, he could not help but be shocked and even his expression changed. But in the next moment, he found that something was wrong. Although he was only an avatar now, he did not lack the knowledge that he should have. As the great virtue entrusted to him, he also knew the power of the great virtue. After the creation essence was broken, it was extremely difficult for the great virtue to return to its original state. For example, when the original God behind him was completed, he had to destroy everything to repay the original debt. Only then could the great virtue behind him return. Although the creation Pauline was powerful, he did not believe that with the ability that Ji Zhuang had shown previously, he could obtain it all. Therefore, things could not be so simple. Perhaps this was indeed the incarnation of the great virtue, but the one in front of him should only be a part of the great virtue. Ji Zhuang Daoren did not pay attention to him. Instead, he lifted his sleeve and took out the creation Pauline again. Then, he raised his hand and gently stroked it. There was a burst of brilliance and the entire mirror lake was instantly enveloped by a layer of golden light. But after a moment, the brilliance dissipated. Then, there seemed to be some kind of unpredictable change in the land of creation. At this time, the Taoist could not help but ask, "Who are you?" Ji Zhuang Daoren looked at him indifferently and did not speak. He waved the Pauline in his hand in front of him. In an instant, a golden light was released and shone down. The Taoist suddenly felt that something was wrong. He only felt that his body had become illusory, as if it was going to disappear from the world. He was instantly shocked and angry, thinking that he was going to be directly destroyed. He shouted, "If I don't exist, aren't you afraid that the original God will return?" Ji Zhuang Daoren just stood there expressionlessly. After a while, the Taoist realized that the other party did not intend to kill him. Instead, he seemed to have used some kind of Taoist technique that caused him to be in a state between nothingness and existence, creating a barrier between him and everything he saw. This feeling was similar to when he first saw Pauline in the Divine Will. He could only watch but not get close. Ji Zhuang Daoren pointed again, and with a rumbling sound, the Taoist sank into the Dharma throne, and disappeared without a trace. After he finished doing this, he put away the lotus and took a step forward. He left the throne and arrived within the hall. The magic energy on his body merely spread out, and a strange and loud sound resounded from within the hall. It was like the sound of a bell being struck, and it slowly drifted out. Zhang Yan stood in the conference hall, looking at the silence with his sleeves behind his back. Just now, when the creation Pauline shone on the Taoist, he had a strong feeling that the existence's avatar had entered the mirror lake. Unless he could enter the mirror lake himself, he would not be able to stop it. However, even if he could break the mirror lake, it would bring more unpredictable consequences. For example, the existence would take advantage of the situation to come, or Ji Zhuang's hidden trump card, or the Yao Han Patriarch's plan. These were all problems. Therefore, he tried his best to delay and strengthen his strength first, so that he could prepare for this. With a thought in his mind, he'd already arrived within the meeting hall, and he instructed True Spirit. "Take my decree and invite all the fellow Taoists here." Before long, Qing Sheng, Shen Chang Boy, Zhan Yuan, Chen Shu, Wan Fang, Bing Kong, and the others arrived in the hall. Except for Shen Chang Boy, everyone else had solemn expressions. Just now, they had all sensed that Busu Tian had caused a great disturbance in outer space, and this time, they clearly knew that he had landed at the Mirror Lake. Now, Busu Tian and that person were both friends and enemies. They were on the same side when it came to dealing with that person, but the premise was that Taoist Ji Zhuang did not cross the line. Otherwise, the consequences would be unpredictable, and it might even lead to a war between the two families. After everyone saw Zhang Yan, they greeted each other and took their seats. Zhang Yan said, "Today, I invited everyone here because of the inexplicable movement in the Mirror Lake. Ji Zhuang Daoren has been using the excuse of suppressing that existence's divine avatar to lure it into the land of creation. Therefore, I tried to stop him several times, but now it seems that he has succeeded." Taoist Shen Chang's expression changed slightly, and he said worriedly, "We felt something was wrong earlier. Could it be that the divine avatar broke free from the suppression and rebelled?" Taoist Qing Sheng sneered. The others' hearts sank as well. Everyone knew how dangerous it was to lure that existence into the land of fortune. If that existence managed to devour this land of fortune, then its strength would definitely increase greatly. Most importantly, even if this divine clone obtained such benefits, it would still not be a match for that existence. Therefore, in the end, it would actually strengthen that existence's strength. This meant that they would very likely have to fight with that existence again, and this time, it would probably be even more powerful than the last time. However, Zhang Yan waved his hand and said, the current situation shouldn't be like this. If the divine avatar broke free from the suppression, then the mirror lake would definitely not be as calm as it seemed on the surface. Whether the two sides fought or swallowed the land of creation, the whaley of the land of creation would definitely be mobilized. As the master of the mirror lake, he didn't notice such a movement, so the situation should still be under Ji Zhuang's control. Putting all this aside, that existence had been chasing after the divine avatar. If it sensed that the movement here was due to the divine avatar obtaining benefits, it would definitely rush over as soon as possible. However, it hadn't arrived yet, which was enough to prove that this was an internal change in the mirror lake. Based on these two factors, it could be said that Zhizhuang Doran's long-term plan had succeeded. He explained his deduction to everyone, and after thinking about it, they all nodded in agreement. Daoist Zhang Yuan frowned and said, fellow Daoist Ji Zhuang has put in a lot of effort to lure the divine avatar here, but I don't believe that he really did it for this matter. There must be some other scheme behind this, but it's hard to guess what it is. Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, there's no need to speculate now. As long as we wait, I believe we'll know the reason. When Patriarch Yao Han and the others suddenly heard a strange sound, they immediately knew that Zhizhuang Daoran was summoning them to the main hall to discuss matters. Everyone also noticed the changes in the mirror lake just now, and they were all surprised. They didn't know what was going on, so they reminded each other and then came together to the main hall to discuss matters. When everyone arrived at the main hall, they saw Daoist Ji Zhuang sitting on the Dharma throne. There was a white brilliance behind him. It looked like a jade mirror, but upon closer inspection, it was illusory, as if it was not there at all. Patriarch Yao Han narrowed his eyes. Spirit refinement cultivators didn't judge people by their appearance, but by their magic power and aura. At this moment, compared to the original Ji Zhuang, he looked somewhat different. Not only him, but everyone present also felt the same way. They were able to discern that perhaps this person wasn't that person from before, and some unknown change had definitely occurred here. Moreover, when they thought about how this person had always wanted to invite that existence's divine clone into the dimension, they couldn't help but feel slightly suspicious in their hearts, and all of them secretly raised their vigilance. But Zhizhuang Daoran said, fellow Taoists, please sit down. Everyone looked at each other and sat down in order. Zhizhuang Daoran said calmly, don't worry, everyone. Just now, I used a Taoist technique to comprehend the truth. Now that I've succeeded, I've returned from my solitude, which is why my aura has changed. Returned from his solitude? It wasn't hard for everyone present to understand this, and they couldn't help but look at Zhizhuang. Could this person be the incarnation of a great benevolence? For a moment, they found it hard to believe. Zhizhuang Daoran continued, today, I've invited everyone here because a fellow Taoist of mine wanted to destroy everything in order to free himself. However, everything in the world has its own Tao, and we can't act rashly because of self-interest. Destroying the essence of creation was already a mistake, how can we do it again? So, I'll let go of our past relationship and cut off his path of return. Everyone's heart shuddered. Hearing this person's words, it was indeed not the Ji Zhuang they had seen before, but a great benevolence had returned. However, even though they had this thought, there were still doubts in their hearts that had not been resolved. If the great virtue returned, then the various beings would definitely be alarmed, and although what they felt just now made their hearts palpitate, it was far from that level. Taoist Sky-reaching cupped his hands and asked, then, what do you want to do? Although that existence's divine essence was split up last time, if it can't hide, we won't be able to find it. Not long ago, it swallowed back one of its divine essences. Although the other one is still fleeing outside, it doesn't look like it will be free for long. When it returns, I'm afraid that all worlds will still be harmed by it. Jizhuang Daoren said, I've already explained this matter clearly. As long as everyone stops here and doesn't ask about the Tao, and the living beings in the world don't seek the Tao, then we can make that one never appear again. At this point, he waved his sleeve, and everyone saw a platform rise in the distance. There was a Taoist imprisoned on it. Due to the unique aura, everyone could immediately recognize that this was the divine clone of that existence. At this moment, everyone revealed a shocked expression. Jizhuang Daoren said, everyone, please calm down. This person has been sealed here by my technique and has been separated from the world. Not to mention the fact that he can't escape, even if the seal is broken, as long as my Tao is not exhausted, he can't be swallowed back by the original master. He looked at the platform, and the light behind him lit up again. His voice entered everyone's mind, and he asked, now, I only ask, are you all willing to follow my suggestion? Everyone felt a chill in their hearts when they felt this power. Since sitting down, Ancestor Yao Han had been looking at Jizhuang Daoren. He smiled and suggested, I'm afraid it's not appropriate for me to break it off alone. As you said before, this must be approved by Bushutian. Jizhuang Daoren nodded and said, fellow Taoist Yao Han is right. This matter also involves Bushutian, so we should summon everyone to discuss this matter. I'll have to trouble fellow Taoists to invite them. Chapter 2135. Ancestor Yao Han came out of the mirror lake and arrived before Bushutian. He bowed and said, fellow Taoist, are you here? I am here on the Mirror Lord's order to send a message. Zhang Yan had been paying attention to all the movements in the mirror lake. When he saw that person arrive, he smiled and said to the rest of the people, he finally came. With a thought, he released a clone outside and returned the greeting. What does fellow Taoist Jizhuang want to say? Ancestor Yao Han said, it is about that existence. Fellow Taoist Jizhuang seems to have a solution, so I came to invite you, Bushutian, and the others to have a chat. Zhang Yan smiled faintly and said, fellow Jizhuang previously said that you invited that existence's divine avatar to enter the realm and suppress it. That way, you can prevent it from returning. Previously, there were many strange phenomena, and now you were sent here. It seems that this matter has been completed. Ancestor Yao Han said, fellow Taoist Jizhuang has always acted arbitrarily. We are only relying on him for protection, so how can we act arbitrarily? What's more? When he spoke up to here, he chuckled and said, I'm afraid fellow Jizhuang is no longer the fellow Jizhuang from before. He said that he had already realized his true self and returned from solitude. He's like a virtuous person, so he can naturally decide what he wants to do. There's no need for him to care about our feelings. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. If Ancestor Yao Han's words were true, then his premonition from before could be explained. If Jizhuang was a virtuous person, then everything he did must be the same as the virtuous person behind that existence. It was likely that he wanted to guide his own power back. However, he did not completely succeed. With the virtuous person's ability, there was no need for him to invite them for a discussion. He could just use his own power to suppress everything. Actually, from the bottom of his heart, he was happy to see cultivators of the upper realms. Because in this way, perhaps he would be able to learn from them to ascend, and he wouldn't have to constantly walk on the unknown path of the Tao. After these thoughts flashed through his mind, he opened his mouth and said, then please wait for a moment, fellow Taoist. Let me discuss with my fellow Taoists, and then I will give you a reply. Ancestor Yao Han cupped his hands and said, please go ahead, Tao friend. Zhang Yan's consciousness returned to his body and informed everyone that Patriarch Yao Han was here on behalf of Jizhuang Daoren. Taoist Xincheng asked, what do you think we should do? Zhang Yan, just now, Yao Han has said a lot, but as for the actual situation, we shouldn't just listen to one person's words. Only by going there will we know. Since Jizhuang has invited us to go, why don't you all follow me? Qing Sheng, Shin Cheng, and the others nodded and said, we are willing to follow you. After the agreement was made, everyone's thoughts moved and an avatar came out of Bushutian. Because Zhang Yan's qi and power body had merged together, this clone was very different from the other spirit refinement cultivators. However, if he didn't want to, others wouldn't be able to see through the secret and would only think that he was using a Dao technique to conceal himself. Seeing them appear, Ancestor Yao Han cupped his hands and said, "Fellow Taoists, please follow me." Then, he led everyone to follow the flow of qi and soon arrived outside the mirror lake. As Ancestor Yao Han descended, Zhang Yan waved his sleeves and followed. Everyone else followed, but suddenly, they felt like their senses had been taken away. It was as if a long time had passed and they had just woken up just now. However, even though they were only avatars, they still caused some mana fluctuations. Logically speaking, when spirit refinement cultivators fought with each other, they should be able to learn some things. But now, they discovered something different. There seemed to be a force protecting the Mirror Lake cultivators. When their mana passed through, it was only an empty space. Nothing could be reflected on their bodies. Instead, many things that they wanted to conceal were inadvertently revealed. Fortunately, they were only avatars, so even if these things were known, it wasn't a big deal. Zhang Yan had also sensed this abnormality. Without batting an eyelid, he circulated his strength path body and sealed all the profound manifestations so that no one could see through them. Ancestor Yao Han turned a blind eye to all of this. He led the way and called for Bushutian's group to move forward. Before long, they arrived outside a large hall. Without any need to announce their arrival, they were directly invited inside. Zhang Yan was the first to enter the hall. When he looked up, he saw Jizhuang Daoren sitting in the main seat. He silently sensed that Jizhuang Daoren's body was like metal, and his mana was empty. There was nothing he could use for reference. Shen Chang, Qing Sheng, and the others had never seen Jizhuang before, but they felt that his qi was very different from ordinary spirit refinement cultivators. It was very deep and unpredictable. There seemed to be a strange white light behind him, but when they looked closely, it was difficult to see clearly. Daoist Jizhuang's gaze shifted to Zhang Yan, but he found it difficult to see through the layer of concealment on the latter's body. His expression changed slightly, and he stood up from his seat, bowed, and said, "Greetings, fellow Daoist Xianyuan." Zhang Yan smiled and returned the greeting. He looked at the seat and asked, "How should I address you now?" Everyone became attentive. Although it was just a short question, it pointed out the crux of the matter. They all knew that Jizhuang Daoren had the Vedanta's entrustment, but they didn't know whether they were facing Jizhuang himself or the Vedanta who had returned. Jizhuang Daoren was silent for a while, then said, "Fellow Daoist, you can call me Jizhuang now." When everyone heard that he was still using the name Jizhuang, they felt inexplicably relieved. This meant that his consciousness was still in control. After all, the Vedanta were too unpredictable, and no one knew what they could do. None of them wanted to face them. Zhang Yan's eyes moved slightly. Other than the person in front of him, his cultivation was higher than anyone else's, so he could hear more from this person's words. In reality, Jizhuang Daoren was still Jizhuang, but he had merged with the Vedanta's Weili into his body. But as he expected, this was not complete. This person's next goal might be to complete the Weili. Jizhuang Daoren gestured at this time and said, "Fellow Taoists, you have come from afar. Please take a seat and talk." Zhang Yan thanked him and sat opposite him. Bu Shutian and the others also sat in the guest seats behind him. Jizhuang Daoren first pointed and said, "Fellow Taoist, look over there." Zhang Yan looked in the direction he pointed and saw that there was a platform there, and underneath it was suppressing an ethereal figure. When the sword-wielding Taoist split that existence's divine energy, he was right in front of it, so he recognized with a single glance that this was one of the divine energy clones. This clone was currently being restrained by a special method and was unable to escape. Jizhuang Daoren said, "Not long ago, I captured this avatar and suppressed it here. I also used a Taoist technique to restrain it so that it will not be devoured by the Almighty." As he spoke, he sighed and said, I've written to fellow Taoists several times saying that I can suppress this divine clone, but fellow Taoists didn't believe me and even obstructed me several times. Now it can be proven that what I said was true. Zhang Yan smiled faintly and said, since you can understand yourself and have the power of great virtue, why didn't you say so earlier? Zhizhuang Daoren sighed and said, it is not that I don't want to say it, but what I have done has the suspicion of going against the heavens. I am afraid that if I say it, it will cause unpredictable changes and I may not be able to return. Zhang Yan said, fellow Taoist, now that you've recovered your strength and sealed this person, I presume you've already made proper arrangements for that person. Zhizhuang Daoren said, that is why I invited fellow Taoist Xianyuan and Bushutian here today. Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, please speak, fellow Taoist. Zhizhuang Daoren said, ever since that fellow Taoist placed his will outside, his will began to devour everything. I believe that I am a Tao protector, and the destruction of the essence of creation is already our fault. Now, I cannot sit back and watch as it destroys everything, so I still need to carry out the previous plan. He looked left and right before looking at Zhang Yan, saying, only by cutting off our Tao can we prevent that fellow Taoist from returning. Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. In the past, Zhizhuang Daoren had hinted that the existence was the will of many great virtues. Later, he found the sword-bearing Taoist and deduced that there was only one person who did this. Now that he heard what Zhizhuang Daoren said, it was clear. Taoist Qing Sheng snorted. Zhizhuang Daoren immediately noticed it and looked over, saying, fellow Taoist, what do you want to say? Taoist Qing Sheng said from his seat, fellow Taoist, aren't you trying to cut off my path of cultivation? Zhizhuang Daoren shook his head and said, it's not like that. If it wasn't for the danger ahead, why would I forcefully interfere with your cultivation? Compared to being forced into eternal silence, isn't staying in Hengshu a better choice? Taoist Qing Sheng said, fellow Taoist, you didn't say that fellow Taoist Xianyuan had defeated that fellow Taoist and had the intention to split his divine vitality. Why didn't you try to subdue him with force, but instead retreat? Zhizhuang Daoren said, I have said this before. You can win once, but you can't win every time. Even if his divine vitality is split, his power will still rise. Such resources are with all of you, in the billions of realms. One day, he will surpass us, and no one will be able to stop him. Seeing that Taoist Qing Sheng had spoken, Taoist Xinchang pondered for a while, then he bowed and said, can I say something? Zhizhuang Daoren said politely, I have invited all of you here for a discussion. Feel free to speak your mind. Taoist Xinchang thanked him and said, I have a question. Fellow Taoist, since you have comprehended your own self, I assume that your magical powers are far above us. Could it be that even with your abilities, you still can't stop that fellow Taoist? Zhizhuang Daoren shook his head and said, I have only recovered a portion of my magical powers, not all of them. The reason why I did this is to prevent everyone from getting into trouble. Moreover, that fellow Taoist had left behind more than just these. The best solution here is to cut off the source. Moreover. As he said this, he looked around at everyone, to put it bluntly, although I have the intention to protect everyone and I am willing to do my best, if that fellow Taoist really returns, it won't affect me much. Instead, it will be detrimental to all of you. Therefore, I still need all of you to save yourselves. Chapter 2136. Everyone was shocked when they heard Zhizhuang Daoren's words. Zhizhuang was clearly telling them that if they didn't want everything to collapse, they could only do their best to protect it. They didn't need to rely too much on that person. Moreover, if that person saw that things couldn't be done, he wouldn't try his best to stop them. Perhaps, he would let that person do whatever he wanted. Zhang Yan smiled faintly. He didn't think so. Zhizhuang's words were half true and half false. That person had tried every means possible to return to this place and even summoned them together for a discussion. How could such a serious matter be abandoned just like that? Moreover, the purpose of this wasn't to protect Zhu Yu as he had said, but rather, it was likely that he had other intentions. Taoist Zhang Yuan pondered for a moment before he cupped his hands and bowed to Taoist Jizhuang. With a solemn expression, he said, I only have one question. If we do as fellow Taoists said, can we really stop that person from returning? Taoist Jizhuang's expression also turned serious, and he said, even Dada can't see through all the changes in the heavenly secrets. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a thing as the essence of creation being destroyed. However, if everyone does as I say, as long as I'm around, I can guarantee that the will that was entrusted to me can no longer destroy everything. Zhang Yuan nodded silently, bowed again, and said no more. At this time, Jizhuang Daoren looked at Zhang Yan, waiting for the latter's reply. As a master, he knew very well that as long as Zhang Yan, the heavenly imperial master, agreed, the opinions of the others didn't matter at all. Xian Che, Towering Sky, and the others also looked over. In fact, they also didn't agree with this matter, but since they were sheltering in Mirror Lake, they couldn't directly oppose it. However, if Zhang Yan didn't agree, then this matter wouldn't be able to be carried out, and the pressure would be shouldered by Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan thought for a moment. He knew very well that if he really didn't want to do as Jizhuang Daoren suggested, then the two families would most likely start a war. He was fearless towards this. Just as he'd thought before, the other party wasn't a true great virtue after all, and he hadn't reached the point where he could suppress everything. However, he had a feeling that a direct battle was not the best choice. There was probably a great hindrance here, and this hindrance did not come from Ji Zhuang himself, but from somewhere else. He pondered deeply for a moment, then tried to calculate again, and came up with a plan in his mind. However, he did not make a decision immediately. Instead, he decided to ask for everyone's opinion. After all, he had defeated that existence, so he had already severed his karma with him. He was not bound by this method. The ones who would truly suffer losses were Bu Su Tian's companions. He immediately changed his mind and entered the unknown. In the next moment, all the cultivators under the protection of Bu Su Tian appeared one by one. Zhang Yan treated everyone and said, "What do you think of this matter?" Taoist Qing Sheng said to himself, "Fellow Taoist, you mustn't agree to this." Since Ji Zhuang admitted that he couldn't do anything to that person and that his methods were only a so-so, why should we care about his words? At worst, we'll just fight. Taoist Zhang Yuan shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, you're wrong. The power of Dada is not something I can judge. We don't know Ji Zhuang's background, and that existence is always coveting him. The situation is complicated, and the people of Mirror Lake haven't said anything yet. How can we fight so easily?" Taoist Qing Sheng looked around and saw that no one else spoke. He sneered and said, "Do you think that I'm acting on impulse? Just now, I'm secretly investigating, and the companions in Mirror Lake are also quite dissatisfied with this. It's obvious that their hearts are not on Ji Zhuang's side. If we can persuade them to join us, we might not have to be afraid of that person with our combined strength." Luan Fang chimed in, "Fellow Taoists' words are not without reason. Let's not talk about the others, but that Yao Han has a deep mind. I've dealt with him several times, and I dare say that he must have a plan. It's just that he doesn't dare to jump out now because there's no one to take the lead. If I fight with Ji Zhuang, he will definitely cooperate in secret." Taoist Xinchang pondered for a long time, and then said slowly, "Fellow Taoist, I think we can agree to this." Taoist Qing Sheng stared at him and said, "Fellow Taoist is also a person who pursues the great Tao. Could it be that you're afraid of the enemy's strength, and want to give up on the Tao?" Taoist Xinchang said, "That's not it. I have other considerations." He looked at everyone and said, "Listen to me, everyone. Heaven's secrets are always changing, but how can it be fixed forever? He has personally admitted that it's difficult to calculate the secrets of heaven, so it's absolutely impossible for him to cut off your Tao and never change. We don't have to clash with him now, and we can just agree and wait patiently. There will be a day when the heaven and earth changes." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. When he conversed with the sword-bearing Taoist, the other party also thought the same. It was absolutely impossible for Jizhuang Daoren to maintain the situation as he said. It was impossible for Ji Zhuang to not know this, so he guessed that he must be trying to do something, but he didn't want another Vedanta to come in at this time and disrupt the situation. That was why he was so concerned about this matter, and once he achieved his goal, he would definitely put this matter aside. Taoist Zhang Yuan also voiced his agreement at this time. He said, although I don't know what kind of ability Zhizhuang Daoren has, if we fight, let's not talk about the outcome first, and instead give that existence a chance. It's better to agree for now and wait for the heaven to change again. Then, we can talk about it again. Everyone here is eternal, neither dead nor alive. Is this really the only time we need? Chen Shu also said, I think that the one who calls himself a Vedanta and invited us here must have something to rely on. Regardless of whether it's a fight or a peace, we must be careful. Zhang Yan turned his head to the other side and looked at Boy Shinchang, who had been biting his finger. He smiled and said, what do you think, fellow Taoist? Boy Shinchang shook his head repeatedly and said, it's useless, it's useless. Everyone looked at each other in dismay. They didn't know whether his words were useless in a fight or a peace talk. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment and then smiled slightly. Obviously, he understood what Boy Shinchang meant. Taoist Qing Sheng snorted coldly and looked at him. What do you say, fellow Taoist? Zhang Yan looked at everyone and said, actually, I have the intention to fight with him. This person calls himself a Vedanta, so I might be able to catch a glimpse of a superior Tao technique from him. That would be beneficial to me and everyone here. Moreover, Taoist Luanfang is right. That person, Yao Han, has sent me many letters, asking me to join him in seizing the Mirror Lake. Therefore, it is true that the people under Ji Zhuang are uncertain. At this point, he paused for a moment and said, just now, Taoist Chen Shu said that this person might have something to rely on. This is not a lie. I also have the same feeling. After some calculations, I suspect that even if I don't agree to this, I'm afraid I won't be able to stop Ji Zhuang's action of sealing off everyone's Tao path. Everyone was shocked. They could ignore what Chen Shu said, but Zhang Yan's cultivation was undoubtedly the highest among them. Moreover, he was the master of several places of creation. If he had the same feeling, it would be very believable. Zhang Yan said again, everyone, please calm down. Whether it is war or peace, let me talk to Ji Zhuang first before we decide. Everyone cupped their hands and said, we will follow your decision, Taoist. Zhang Yan retreated from the spirit's will and looked at the seat. Just now, everyone expressed their opinions and mentioned most of the things that could trigger a war. However, they did not touch on the other issue. Zhizhuang Daoren wanted the spirit refinement cultivators to stop cultivating. At the same time, he also wanted the living beings in the present world to stop pursuing the Tao. Perhaps in the eyes of his peers, the life and death of the present world was but an instant. The living beings in there could appear with a thought and disappear with a thought. Naturally, they did not need to care about it. However, he was the master of Busu Tian, and he had many juniors and disciples in his sect. How could he abandon it? He needed to demand an explanation for it. Zhizhuang Daoren also looked over. However, he did not speak. Instead, he transferred his spirit's will over. Zhang Yan sensed it and knew that he wanted to talk to him alone. He immediately changed his mind and welcomed his spirit's will. The two of them also entered an unknown place. Zhizhuang Daoren asked, what do you think, Taoist? Zhang Yan put his sleeves behind his back and said, Taoist, you should know that what we seek is nothing more than the Tao. I'm afraid that not many people are willing to compromise. If you do not have any means, then there will be a fight between our two sections. Zhizhuang Daoren was silent for a while. Then, he lifted his sleeve and a Pauline flower appeared. Even in this unknown place, it could not hide the golden light on it. Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. In this inexplicable moment, his divine wills intertwined with each other. He immediately knew what this item was and could clearly see the power contained within it. He said, so fellow Taoist has this item. Zhizhuang Daoren said, I have this creation Pauline in my hand. No matter if you agree or not, I only need to activate its power to make things go my way. No matter how strong you are, you will not be able to stop me. Zhang Yan knew that he was speaking the truth. From what he saw just now, this creation Pauline didn't need to be in a battle. As long as it was activated, it could easily obstruct the path of Tao. Therefore, what Jizhuang Daoren said was not an exaggeration. This person could indeed do such a thing. However, if a spirit refinement cultivator was unwilling to give up and still pursued the upper realm and continued to compete with it, then he would need to divide a part of his power to resist. Therefore, he deduced that this person probably wanted to use this Pauline to do something. Therefore, he did not want his power to be implicated here for no reason. He thought for a while. Since the other party showed this treasure, there was no point in fighting with him now. If there was no equivalent treasure, he would not be able to stop him. He nodded and said, since fellow Taoist has this item, I will explain the situation to fellow Taoists. Jizhuang Daoren's expression relaxed. Just now, he did not take out the creation Pauline in the hall. Instead, he showed it to Zhang Yan in private. He did not want the latter to think that he had the intention to force him. If he did so, he might make things worse. Just as Zhang Yan expected, he had a great use for this item. He did not want to waste his energy on this matter. It would be best if he could solve this peacefully. He said, then it's a deal between fellow Taoist and me. Zhang Yan shook his head and said, could it be that you have forgotten that there is one more thing that needs to be solved? Taoist Jizhuang made an "oh" sound and looked at him. Fellow Taoist, please speak. Zhang Yan looked at him and said, the matter that you want to do not only involves many people of the same Tao, but also the theory of severing the Tao in this world. What should I say? Chapter 2137. Jizhuang Daoren couldn't help but feel surprised. He looked at Zhang Yan as if he didn't expect Zhang Yan to care about such a matter. He pondered for a while and said, what do you think about this? Zhang Yan's eyes flickered and then disappeared. Ever since his qi and strength merged into one, his sensing ability was far beyond what it used to be, and he could easily peek into places that he didn't know before. Just now, he keenly sensed that Jizhuang Daoren seemed to not care about this matter, but in reality, he was very concerned about it. He immediately began to calculate. Could this be the person's true purpose? He couldn't help but think that Tai Ming, Hong He, Yao Han, and Ling Yu, the four founding masters, had left their orthodoxy in the 9 continents. From the muddy heaven that was left behind, their purpose was likely to be to push their descendants to climb to the upper realm, and then use their power to guide them back. Of course, the premise was that these 4 founding masters were affected by the destruction of the essence of creation. Whether this was the case or not, aside from Jizhuang, he hadn't seen any real Vedanta, so he couldn't make a conclusion. But if this was true, then did Jizhuang want to use this opportunity to cut off the path of return for all Vedanta? This was very possible. If this person still wanted the essence of creation, then it was better for one person to enjoy it than to share it with everyone. However, no matter how much power Jizhuang, this Vedanta, had, without a doubt, stood on a higher level when looking at things, and it was difficult for those who hadn't reached this level to see everything. Therefore, he could only act according to his own ideas, and so he said, if you want to cut off the path of Tao of all living beings in the world, I'm afraid it's difficult for I to agree. Jizhuang Daoren asked, why is that? Zhang Yan said, I am the master of Busu Tian, and this place of creation is attached to it. It can be said to exist forever. I have many disciples of the younger generation stationed here, and I don't want to see their Tao destroyed. Jizhuang Daoren nodded and said, so that's the reason, I didn't think it through. This kind of thing could only happen to the master of the place of creation. Usually, there was no one in the world who could attach themselves to it, and in the eyes of all spirit ascension cultivators, it would be destroyed in an instant. But it was different for the world who attached itself to the place of creation. As long as the place of creation was not destroyed, then the world would continue to exist. He thought for a moment and said, fine, I'll give you some face. Now, I'll remove the list of Taoists from Busu Tian. But I will not allow them to enter the spirit ascension state, but they won't be able to enter spirit ascension, and those who passed cannot follow the path before. What Yan think? Zhang Yan thought for a while. From Bu Su Tian's point of view, no matter if it was Dan Yi, Fu Qingming, Michito Ichito, or Wan Kei, because of their limited foundations, they had no hope of entering spirit ascension, so this restriction was actually meaningless to them. And among the sects of the Mountain Sea, there was not even a true Yang Yuan Zun, let alone a spirit ascension Grand Elder. Maybe by the time he found a way to fight against Creation Pauline, there would not even be a true Yang cultivator. But this was not the main point. Now he was even more sure that Ji Zhuang really valued this matter, and the saying that he had to follow the path before him was even more worth pondering. What was the path before him? Generally speaking, the path of Qi was the path before him, and the path of strength could barely be counted. However, the path of Dharma was not included in this list, because this path only existed in theory. Those who succeeded followed the path of Tao and did not respect the predecessors. And speaking from a small point of view, if I created another path, but it was completely different from the path before me, it would not be included in this list. He felt that Ji Zhuang was ostensibly giving in because of him, but in reality, he wanted to make a fuss about this. If he did not mention this matter this time, Ji Zhuang could do whatever he wanted, and he would not have come to explain these things. However, regarding the path of the descendants, he also had some ideas. Thinking about this, he said, then how does Taoist friend intend to do this? Jizhuang Daoren said, there are countless people in the world, and life and death are uncertain. Even if we transcend above it, it is difficult for us to take care of everything. I will use the creation Pauline to save them, as long as Taoist friend does not obstruct me, it will be fine. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He could see that this was the same logic as restraining the cultivation of others. If the person was doing this and there was a spirit refinement almighty being going against him, then even if he succeeded, a part of his power would be affected. In order to avoid this, he was so easy to talk to. This was good news, which meant that as long as there was enough power to hold him back, this matter could be stopped. At this moment, Jizhuang Daoren cupped his hands and said, I have a matter here that I need to ask of Taoist friend. There must be a creation treasure spirit hiding in the silence, and this person might go against me. If it hides everywhere, or tries to seek shelter in Busu Tian, I hope that Taoist friend can stop it outside the door. Zhang Yan said indifferently, it is too early to talk about this kind of unknown matter. If we really encounter it at that time, we can discuss it again. Jizhuang Daoren looked at him, but did not continue to dwell on this matter. He said, today, I will set a rule with Taoist friend. If there is any benefit in the future, I will share it with Taoist friend. However, I know that words are not proof. He reached out and plucked a lotus petal from the creation Pauline, and passed it forward, I will use this as proof. If I don't keep my promise, this treasure will be hard to complete. Zhang Yan thought for a while. He did not believe that it would be hard to complete. Ji Zhuang would definitely not give him such a big weakness. This was just to reassure him. There must be a way to take back this thing. Presumably, the person himself knew that an empty promise was just a piece of paper, and could be overturned at any time. Therefore, this item was used to make him not regret it. In the future, when the matter was completed, he would definitely not abide by this. In fact, he also did not intend to abide by this promise. He did not know what Ji Zhuang wanted to do, and how long it would take to complete it, but he was sure that it would not be beneficial to him. Therefore, he had to find something that could go against him as soon as possible before he succeeded. And before that, he could temporarily not make a move. Thus, he waved his sleeve and kept the lotus petal. Jizhuang Daoren saw that he had kept the petal. He made a bow, and his body disappeared. He had already escaped from this unknown place. Zhang Yan did not retreat from the divine will. Instead, he summoned Shen Cheng, Zhai Yuan, and the others. Then, he told everyone about Jizhuang Daoren's possession of creation Pauline. In the end, he said, from I's point of view, there is no need to take this matter too seriously. Because if I want to break out of this situation, I can turn hostile at any time. The key lies in creation, Pauline. If there is no countermeasure, then even if I fight with him, I have no confidence that I can win. I can try to find a countermeasure first. If I have the opportunity, then it will not be too late to fight with him. What do you all think? Zhizhuang Daoren said that he would use creation Pauline to stop the path of improvement of the cultivators. But in fact, to these spirit refinement cultivators who relied on Busu Tian for protection, the effect was not that big. Not to mention the unfathomable upper third realm, it was not that easy to climb to the second realm. Even for him, he had to borrow the ancestral Master Weili and the opportunity to fight with that existence to pass this gate. If they could easily pass this gate, they would have done so long ago. They would not have to wait until now. So, even if they cut off the opportunity, it would not be any different from before. Everyone was deep in thought. They did not expect Ji Zhuang to have something like creation Pauline in his hands. No one knew what the power of this treasure was. Just from the methods that Ji Zhuang revealed earlier, it was already a little unbelievable. But this was definitely not all. It was not appropriate to act rashly before they had a clear understanding of the situation. Wan Fang and Bing Kong looked at each other and said, "We have no objections. Whether it is war or peace, we will listen to you." They could clearly see that if Zhang Yan did not stand in front of them, Zhizhuang Daoren would not care about them. Today, he would not have come to question them properly. He would only suppress them directly. Looking at Yao Han and the others, they knew that they were not as comfortable as they were in Busu Tian. Taoist Xinchang said, "Since creation Pauline is so powerful, it is useless for us to fight. We might as well agree to this matter first and wait for the right time." Taoist Zhang Yuan also said in a deep voice, "What Taoist Xianyuan and Taoist Xinchang said is right. Since fighting is useless, let's retreat and wait for the right time." Taoist Qing Sheng still had the heart to fight, but he also understood that unless he could break the mirror lake, force Ji Zhuang into eternal silence, and seize the lotus of good fortune, there was no way he could stop this. It was obvious that he couldn't do it now, so he didn't speak anymore. Chen Shu and Boy Xinchang still had the same attitude as before. They did not think that provoking a dispute was a good thing. Seeing that everyone had taken a step back, Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Then this matter is settled. When we return to Busu Tian, I will find a way to fight against creation Pauline." With a thought, he retreated and looked at Zhizhuang Daoren. He raised his hand and bowed, saying, "Since the agreement has been made, I believe that there is nothing else to do here. I will take my leave first." Zhizhuang Daoren had said everything that needed to be said, so he did not ask them to stay. He cupped his hands and said, "Everyone, have a safe journey. Forgive me for not seeing you off." Ancestor Yao Han remained calm and collected on the seats on both sides. Xian Che, Towering Firmament, and the others were slightly disappointed. They were not willing to be bound by Pauline, and they had hoped that Zhang Yan would lead the cultivators of Busu Tian to fight against Ji Zhuang. Then, they could make a decision based on the situation. Unfortunately, the final result was not what they had expected. It seemed that Zhang Yan and Ji Zhuang had reached an agreement that they were not aware of. Zhang Yan led the group out of the mirror lake and returned to Busu Tian in a flash. His consciousness also returned to his body. He pondered for a moment, but he did not take out the lotus petal from his divine will. Instead, he went into an unknown place and observed the petal. After a while, he found something very interesting. If he wanted to, he could use this petal to deduce the battle between him and Zhizhuang Daoren with Pauline. Due to the fact that he cultivated both energy and strength, his body was almost flawless, so his opponent was unable to do anything to him. However, with the protection of the treasured lotus of good fortune, it was also difficult for him to pose too much of a threat to his opponent. However, it was important to know that this was only the power displayed by a single petal. The true power of the treasured lotus of good fortune might not be limited to what he had seen. Thus, if he wanted to fight against it, he had to find another way. Chapter 2138. Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. The reason why this lotus petal could be used for deduction should be that Ji Zhuang did it on purpose. He probably knew that the agreement was not of much use, so he wanted to use it to tie Zhang Yan up. In a sense, it could be considered as an overt plot. If he could not beat this person in deduction, then there was no need to talk about fighting. He withdrew from the divine decree, then turned his head and looked at the source of the spiritual opportunity. From the behavior of the spiritual opportunity, it should have some kind of tacit understanding with that existence. However, once Jizhuang Daoren blocked the path of the cultivators and cut off the Tao, then no one in the world could enter the spirit refinement realm. The spiritual opportunity would also become useless. When that time comes, how would that person react? And that existence would not sit idly by and watch this happen. However, since Jizhuang Daoren was carrying out this plan, he should have taken these into consideration. He calculated a little and knew that it would not take long before Jizhuang Daoren would activate the creation Pauline. He first used his thoughts to inform Dan Yi and the other three that the heavenly secrets were about to change and that they had to find a way to maintain the order. Then, in a flash, a great consciousness was passed down. At this moment, all the living beings in Buxu heaven who had achieved Tao felt a consciousness enter their minds. Almost in an instant, they understood that due to the changes in the heavenly secrets, not long after, the path of heaven would be cut off and the world would disappear. In the future, people would no longer be able to rely on the Tao to seek immortality and transcend. When many cultivators in the upper realm heard about this, they were worried. This was because once the path of heaven was cut off, if one could not cultivate in this life and wanted to reincarnate to cultivate, then it would be impossible to do so. However, even if billions of people entered the Tao, how many of them would really be able to enjoy immortality? This way, as time passed, the number of cultivators in the world would only decrease until there were only a few. Only cultivators who had cut off their past and future bodies, or even those who had transcended this realm, could stay in the world forever. As for the cultivation sects, they would undoubtedly fall. Even the great sects would only be able to hold on for a little longer. After the various sects came to their senses, they all sent their disciples out in an attempt to recruit more disciples before this unforeseen event arrived. Even though this method couldn't fundamentally change the situation, it could still slightly delay the decline and prevent it from collapsing too quickly. A spiritual light flashed in the hall, and the formation spirit appeared. It bowed towards the throne and said, "Master, High Sovereign Fu is here. He said he has something to ask of you." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Please come in, fellow Taoist Fu." The formation spirit immediately flashed outside and said, "High Holiness Fu, Old Master invites you in." Fu Qingming nodded and walked into the hall. Right now, his heart was also rather heavy. The myriad heavens were more prosperous than the mountain and sea realm, and had more cultivators. Now that the Tao technique was gone, it would not cause much chaos. Although the Green Jade Palace could straighten things out, the prosperity of the heavens would gradually decline. Not to mention that, as a Tao god, he relied on good deeds and dharma. If even the Tao technique didn't exist, it would be difficult for him to maintain himself. The key was not just the myriad heavens, but all the realms he knew were in the same situation. He couldn't even find a way out, so he had to come to Zhang Yan to ask for a solution. Fu Qingming quickly arrived at the hall. When he saw Zhang Yan, he bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan bowed and said, "I know why you are here." He stretched out his finger and pointed, and a ray of clear light flowed down like water. When Fu Qingming was illuminated by this light, he felt his entire body tremble. He suddenly realized that in this instant, his original body of Tao God had actually reverted back to the Dharma body that he had cultivated when he was still alive. At this moment, he deeply felt the unfathomable Weili of the refined God Grand Supreme. He bowed gratefully and said solemnly, "Thank you, fellow Taoist, for helping me return to my original state." Zhang Yan shook his head and said, "It's just a small matter." Everything in the current world was too weak for the refined God Grand Supreme. They could do whatever they wanted. Although Fu Qingming had broken free from the restraint of the Tao God, he still hadn't transcended. His life and death were still hanging in the hands of those in the upper realm. At this moment, he suddenly looked up into the void and said, "It's coming." Fu Qingming's heart shook. A moment later, an indescribable pressure suddenly enveloped him. It was like a black fog that covered everything. It was boundless and extremely cold. It drowned all his senses. At this moment, it was as if he was the only one left in the heavens. At this moment, the higher the cultivation, the stronger the feeling. However, the lower generation disciples didn't feel anything. They didn't even know that just now, they had already been blocked by the upper realm and their future path had been completely cut off. After a while, Fu Qingming just now withdrew from that feeling. He let out a long sigh. Just now, the wailing made him unable to have any thoughts of resisting. He shook his head and forcefully expelled the remaining feeling. Then, he silently examined himself and found that he seemed to be no different from just now. But as he examined deeper, he found that something was wrong. On the originally clear and bright beer, there seemed to be a speck of dust that couldn't be wiped away. It was as if he had put a shackle on his body. It turned out that the Tao was no longer harmonious. Zhang Yan's eyes were extremely deep. Creation Pauline was indeed impressive. She directly exerted her power in the land of creation. As the saying goes, cut off the path to heaven, cut off the fate of Dharma. He could feel that if he interfered, he could reverse this power. But it was useless. This power came like water. If he relaxed even a little, it would flow back. And this was under the situation where the other party didn't push him from behind. If he had fallen out with Ji Zhuang just now in the Mirror Lake, although Pauline might not be able to do anything to him, the others were different. Since this treasure could be used to obstruct the Tao of living beings, it could also be used to kill all living beings. If the person killed the world or even the living beings in Busu and anger, he wouldn't be able to stop it. Fu Qingming sighed, "From now on, I'm afraid we'll be separated forever." Zhang Yan looked down and said with his sleeves behind his back, "Although the Tao techniques have been broken, the Shin Tao hasn't." What was very interesting was that even though Busu's fate with the Tao had ended, the gods in the Kunshur continent weren't affected at all. This was because they didn't rely on their own cultivation in the first place. And those strange beasts were no different from before. They didn't cultivate and relied on the power they were born with, so they weren't affected by this. However, these effects would gradually show up in the days to come. For example, the countries of the Tao on the Kunshur continent lacked the support of the Tao techniques. Perhaps there wouldn't be much change now, but as more and more cultivators started to cherish their lives, they might have to rely on the power of the gods in the future. Previously, he judged that Jizhuang Daoren used so much power to make a fuss about the living beings in the world. Therefore, there should be other actions in the future. He wanted to see what this person would do. Just as he was thinking, the formation spirit came to report, "Master, exalted Dan Yi has come to visit." Zhang Yan, invite him in. Dan Yi quickly came to the front of the hall. Seeing that Fu Qingming was also there, he nodded to him and went forward to greet Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan invited them and said, "Fellow Taoists, please sit down and talk." The two of them expressed their gratitude and sat down. After Dan Yi sat down, he bowed again and said, "I wonder if fellow Taoist can explain the origin of this Tao technique?" Zhang Yan, the mortal world's Tao technique is the ability of a supreme treasure. As for the specific reason, because it involves a few powerful figures, I can't tell fellow Taoist. Although this power can't be stopped now, this situation won't last forever. There will definitely be a day when it changes, so fellow Taoist doesn't need to be too pessimistic. Danny sighed and said, "But the impact is still too great. Although it doesn't harm us, there are very few cultivators who can reach the upper realm. After millions of years, the sects will definitely decline." Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, "Fellow Taoist, if you have anything to say, feel free to say it." Danny said, "I want to join forces with fellow Taoists to create a place that contains the essence of the spirit vault. We will use our supernatural powers to protect this place. Now, all cultivators can hide in it and be considered to be separated from the human world. As long as cultivators don't leave this place, they can enjoy a long life. This way, they might be able to last until fellow Taoist Xianyuan changes the situation. At that time, the cultivators of the various worlds won't suffer too much loss. When Fu Qingming heard that, he nodded in agreement as well. With the might of their own divine abilities, it was sufficient to protect the world from being destroyed. He said, "Not long ago, we promised the 3 clans of the heavenly fiends that in the future, their disciples would be able to compete with the disciples of our human path to determine the ownership of the Dark Stone. Now it would seem like this method is the right one. At the very least, they won't cause trouble for us anymore." Zhang Yan thought for a while. This place that contains the essence of the spirit vault was actually to separate a realm from the outside world. The inside contained the essence of the world, while the outside was mundane. In this way, mortals and cultivators would be completely separated. But at the moment, it was still a way to prolong the existence of the various sections. He nodded and said, "This method is also feasible. Fellow Taoists, please do as you see fit." Seeing that he agreed, Danny thanked him and left with Fu Qingming. Zhang Yan stood in the palace and thought about a way to resist Good Fortune Pauline. Just now, when the Whaley seeped in, he saw everything clearly. Although Good Fortune Pauline could affect all living beings, she had no effect on the entire land of fortune, so she shouldn't be able to shake the Good Fortune Whaley. It should be because Pauline's power had avoided the Good Fortune Whaley. Otherwise, once the two collided, there would be a conflict. That was why he speculated that the reason Pauline's power could seep in was because the inner realm's power hadn't been expelled yet. If he could completely integrate the power of the Busu heaven, he should be able to block it. He glanced at the Busu heaven. If he didn't count the realm that might be hidden, he could see that there was only one part of the chaos sky that was still outside the Busu heaven. However, it wouldn't be long before he closed in. Once he took control of the chaos sky, he would begin to investigate the secret places. He would try to expel the foreign force that was obstructing him and not give her any loopholes to exploit. At the same time, he needed to find a treasure to resist Good Fortune Pauline. He already knew the origin of this treasure, and there seemed to be more than one of it. The best result would be to find another one. That way, he would be able to resist Good Fortune Pauline. Although the hope was very slim, he still had to try. Chapter 2139. When Dan Yi and Fu Qingming returned, they immediately discussed their ideas with Wan Kei and Michihito Ichido. The two of them expressed their agreement, and then immediately began to set up the spirit-containing essence land. Given the abilities of the true Yang Yuan Zun, it was a simple task. With the 4 of them working together, it only took a mere thought for them to create an inner world, which they then sent out to all the other heavens. When the Taoists of all the heavens learned of the existence of this place, quite a few of them tried to enter it. Upon arriving, they discovered that both upper realm cultivators and lower realm disciples could sense that they were being protected by a powerful aura, and that their lifespans were being extended significantly. However, because the 4 great Yuan Zun only protected this part of the world, if you left it, you would no longer be protected. Furthermore, every time you left it, your lifespan would decrease. The sects of the mountain and sea realm were the first to react, and all of them moved their sects into this place. 2 months later, in the outskirts of the state of Shenfang, there was a Tao palace. In the past, there would have been thousands of people discussing the Tao and the Dharma, but now it was empty. As the sun was about to rise, Daoren walked out of the Tao palace, followed by a dozen or so disciples. Daoren turned around, stroked his beard, and said, "You can go back later. There's no need to send me off." The disciple walking in front looked very reluctant. "Master, are you really going to leave?" Daoren sighed. "Since the sect has summoned me, I have no choice but to return. Besides, there are no more Taoist techniques in the world. What's the point of me staying here?" The disciple said bitterly, "Master, I've already asked around. Not only are the Taoist techniques useless, even the mysterious techniques taught in the Tao Palace are the same. I'm afraid that all cultivation methods under the heavens have been severed." The Taoist thought for a moment, then said seriously, even though these two techniques are useless, cultivation methods will not be severed. Since the spirit of heaven and earth still exists, and since our ancestors were able to observe the Taoist techniques of heaven and earth, our descendants will also be able to find a way out. The disciple looked at him expectantly. Master, can you point out a clear path? Daoren was silent for a while before he said, I don't have any good ideas for now. The disciple couldn't help but reveal a disappointed expression. Daoren reached out and patted him. You don't have to worry too much. When I return, I will consult sect leader Wei on how to deal with this matter. He is Shang Jinren and also a disciple of Yuan Zun. I think he should be able to find a way. Once he has an answer, I will try to inform you. The disciple revealed a look of pleasant surprise and said, Thank you, teacher. Daoren said, Your master is leaving. The disciple and the dozen or so people behind him bowed and said, Farewell, teacher. The Taoist nodded and stomped his feet. Suddenly, a gust of astral wind rose from the ground and carried him into the sky. Then, he silently chanted a spell in his heart and suddenly found himself in another world. He turned around and flew in the direction of the sect. In the blink of an eye, 3 years passed. The consequences of those who came later could no longer cultivate Tao techniques were gradually revealed. Many sects had tried. The newly accepted disciples, no matter how high their qualifications were, could not cultivate even half a bit of inner qi. There were some breathing techniques that could still be used, but the effect of cultivating them was only to strengthen the body. If one persisted for a long time, at most they would become sharper and sharper, but their strength would not increase by much. If the path in front of them could not be taken, most people would naturally think of ways to change to another path. In these few years, other than those who still refused to give up and still insisted on the original method, in these few years, the cultivation method had already begun to change. One of the changes was to use external medicine as much as possible. Although the Tao technique was broken, the spiritual opportunity was still there. Therefore, pills, precious medicines, and even various instruments could still be refined. As long as one consumed the pill and used various spells to refine it, he would still be able to obtain extraordinary power. Although this method greatly increased the demand for external medicine, but now that the world was flourishing with spiritual opportunity, there was no need to worry about a shortage. However, there was a problem here. Not to mention ordinary pills, there was no need to talk about them. Even a low-level disciple could refine them. However, those pills that could be said to be superior in effect needed to be refined by people with profound skills. Moreover, they were extremely rare. Therefore, using this method, there were very few people who could reach the upper state. Moreover, using pure external medicine to push one to the upper state, this was only a possibility. Most people would only linger in the state of clear qi. However, most cultivators thought that if they could maintain this, it was actually not bad. At least, when the future people entered the land with spirit, they could rely on pills to extend their lifespan by 200 to 300 years. After reincarnation, there was still hope for them to enter Tao. Since the world could change once, there was a possibility that it could change again in the future. It was not impossible to return to the original state. Other than that, there were some cultivators who chose to enter Shin Tao. This way, even if the physical body collapsed, after being sealed, their soul could enjoy eternal life. However, from then on, they would have to be under the jurisdiction of the God Court and would no longer be free. However, this could also be considered immortality in a sense, so many people were willing to enter. The God Court naturally welcomed this. Cultivators cherished their lifespan, and most of them retreated into their inner worlds. Therefore, they could only rely on the gods to fight against the monsters in the Kuan-Shur continent. However, gods were rare to begin with, and it was already good enough that they could protect the countries. In the past, there were many cultivators in the wild killing foreign species, but now that these people had retreated, the situation became somewhat awkward. With these cultivators willing to fill in the gaps, not only did their forces not decline, they even expanded a bit. On the Kuan-Shur continent, there was a towering tree that towered into the sky. Countless aerial roots spread out like spider claws, and upon closer inspection, it was actually slowly moving. Between the branches of the canopy and the branches of the vines, there was a temple that was several acres in size. Below it, a young cultivator was walking on the twisted but abnormally flat branches. Not long after, he stepped into the temple. A huge Ganoderma beneath his feet moved, and hundreds of coiled stems slowly rose up, slowly lifting him up. After reaching a height of about 100 feet, he stopped in front of a house. There was a young cultivator with delicate features and a thin figure inside. He was holding a carving knife and was carving a bamboo slip. However, he would occasionally stop and cough a few times. In front of him, there were several purple sprouts planted. There were heavy fruit buds on them, and they looked like they could fall into the soft mud at any time. The young cultivator said, "Senior Marshal Brother C, are you really not going to the land with spirit?" The cultivator surnamed C coughed and said, "What's the point of going there? With our cultivation, we won't be able to achieve immortality. It won't be long before our Taihao school's teachings are severed." The young cultivator couldn't help but say, "The Supreme Sky sect is nothing more than a fleeting cloud, it has long been destroyed. It's just that Master learned some Taoist teachings from Grand Master back then and used a fake title. So what if it's gone? Besides, with Senior Brother's injuries, if another fierce demon came, how would you be able to withstand it?" The cultivator surnamed C said, "But you and I were adopted by Master. Master has always considered himself a member of the Taihao school. All of our abilities were taught to us by Master, so we can't let him down." At this point, his eyes lit up and he said, "Now is an opportunity. My Taihao school's cultivation method is different from the other sections. We follow the path of nature and extract the essence of plants. I firmly believe that even without using the methods of our predecessors, this method can help me achieve Tao." At this point, his movements subconsciously stopped. "I remember Junior Marshal Brother Chen once told me that when you were young, your dream was to plant a giant tree that reached the heavens. Have you forgotten?" The young cultivator shook his head and walked out. The cultivator surnamed C felt a little sad and coughed violently a few times. However, his eyes were filled with determination. After a while, he realized that something was wrong. He turned around and saw that the young cultivator had walked back. He said in surprise, "Junior Marshal Brother." The young cultivator sighed and said, "Back then, when we were apprenticed together, everyone said that we didn't have the aptitude and wouldn't be able to go far. But I want to see if we can't walk the path of Tao without relying on aptitude." The cultivator surnamed C stood up and said, "Good, if we join hands, we will definitely walk a path." Zhang Yan stood in the Qinghuan Palace with his sleeves behind his back. He could feel that Pauline's power was still affecting him. It didn't stop even after cutting off the path of Tao for those who came later. This was in line with his prediction. Since Jizhuang Daoren was acting like this, there should be something else he wanted to do. He thought that the focus was on those living beings, so he had been paying attention to this. However, there seemed to be no other abnormalities in Busu Tian except for the changes made by the cultivators themselves. He thought about it. It was likely that Ji Zhuang was afraid that he would notice something, so he didn't do anything to Busu Tian. It was also possible that his arrangements hadn't been completed, or he had done it very secretly. It would take some time before he could see any clues. However, he couldn't rule out the possibility that his methods had been placed in other realms. He raised his gaze and looked outside Busu Tian. There were countless realms that were born and destroyed, and they were also under the shroud of good fortune Pauline's Weili. As his magic power fluctuated, many scenes of the realms were reflected in his heart. If there were any changes, he would immediately know. However, after looking around, he didn't find much. Because the path of all realms had been cut off, he wanted to try his idea here. However, after thinking about it, he felt that it wasn't the right time yet. He had to at least wait for Ji Zhuang to make a move before he could act. As he was observing, his heart suddenly palpitated, and he looked towards the source of the spiritual vigor. This person finally started to react, and the rising momentum of his spiritual vigor actually increased by another level. On the surface, this didn't seem to be of much use because without the cultivation of the path, the spiritual vigor couldn't be used properly. However, he knew that if this continued, once it exceeded a certain limit, it would trigger some kind of fundamental change. For example, it was the case for the demons and mutated beings. Because this generation relied on nature to nurture them, the more spiritual vigor flourished, it would only make them more tyrannical. He couldn't help but think, could it be that this person wants to use the mutated beings as a pawn? Chapter 2140. Zhang Yan thought that this existence and the Lord of Spiritium flourishing had the same goal. Now, it was nothing more than pushing living beings to enter the spirit refinement realm. Jizhuang Daoren had cut off the path of cultivators, so it was possible that he wanted to start with the demons. Innate demons like Bai Wei were born from the essence of heaven and earth. If the spiritual opportunity flourished, more of them would be born. If this generation could enter the spirit refinement realm, then that Vedanta could return. However, there was still an obstacle that had not been solved, and that was the mystic stone blocking this path. No matter how powerful this generation was, if he could not overcome it, then he could not reach the level of true yang. Furthermore, the mystic stone could only be produced in the place of creation. If his judgment was correct, then he would have to fight for the place of creation in the end. That Vedanta could not be allowed to return unless he gave up on his method of invading everything. Even though Jizhuang Daoren had his own plans, at least on the surface, he still followed the rules. Even if he cut off his Tao, the order of the world would not be disrupted because of this. In terms of strength, Jizhuang Daoren, who had not recovered his full strength, was obviously easier to deal with than that Vedanta. Therefore, he and Jizhuang had the same interest in stopping that Vedanta from returning. Therefore, he would not let the demons come out. As long as he tried his best to find and protect the place of creation, then he would be able to stop them. Just as he was thinking, Jingyu entered the hall and reported, "Master, Lu Shangzhen and Wei Shangzhen are here." Zhang Yan knew that it was about time for them to arrive. Among all the disciples under his tutelage, these two disciples had the most disciples under them. The others had either not recovered their cultivation, or they didn't care about anything else and only focused on cultivation. He said, "Call them in." Not long after, Lu Yenyi and Wei Zihong entered the hall and bowed to the seat, saying, "Greetings, Master." Zhang Yan excused himself and asked, "How are the disciples?" Lu Yenyi replied, "It's more or less fine." Many of the disciples were terrified at first, but after they entered the inner world, it's just now calm. Wei Zihong said, "It's the same for me. It's normal for the heavens to be in a state of panic, but if I can't walk out of it, then my achievements will be very limited." On the other hand, those disciples with firm hearts might as well stay on the Kunshe continent. Zhang Yan nodded. If it was a disciple who was wholeheartedly devoted to the path of the Tao and was unwavering in his determination, then he indeed didn't care about the outside world and could cultivate anywhere he went. He said, "I know what you all want to ask." This time, the change in the Tao is illuminated by a treasure from beyond the heavens. In the future, the Tao will rise again, but I can't say when it will happen. But as long as I'm still here, there's no need to worry about it. You all just need to restrain your disciples, and it'll be fine. Both Lu Yenyi and Wei Zihong understood what he meant. The rise and fall of the Tao was like the rise and fall of the waves. Some rose and some fell. Even if in the end, only a few people were left, as long as their master was still up there, then these juniors of the same Tao would one day be able to return to the path of the Tao. When they obtained these words, the two of them already had a clear idea of what they should do in the future. Because it was rare for them to come here, they asked their teacher for guidance on some questions they had in cultivation, and they stayed here for around 100 days before they left Qinghuan Palace and returned to the lower dimensions. After Wei Zihong and Lu Yenyi bid farewell, they returned to the Yaoyin clan. Just now, when they sat down, an elder from the Eastern Baron approached them and bowed, saying, "Sect Master, I still have something to say. Recently, I've noticed that the situation in the Eastern Barren continent isn't right. If it continues like this, I'm afraid it'll hinder our Tao. Wei Zihong was surprised and asked, "Why is it so serious?" There was an unconcealable worry between the elder's brows. He handed over a letter and said, "Sect Master, I've written everything about the situation in the inner room." Wei Zihong took the letter and read it once. He already knew what the elder meant. The problem here was in the Eastern Barren Continent. Back then, the sects of the 9 continents came from beyond the heavens and came here to establish their sects and spread the Tao. Many relatives of the nobles of the 100 nations of the Eastern Barren Continent joined the Mountain and Sea Tao sect. Although the original purpose of doing so was to befriend the sects of the 9 continents, because the Tao could prolong one's life, it had already replaced the cultivation of the Tao among the upper echelons of the various countries. However, as the Tao was easier to cultivate, the Tao was not completely abandoned. Because the relatives of the nobles of the upper echelons had all gone to pursue the Tao, it was especially prosperous among the lower echelons. Now that the Tao had been severed, the path of the Tao was also blocked. The purpose of the lower echelons' cultivation was originally for military warfare, not for longevity. Therefore, they accepted the method of using elixirs to boost their cultivation without any hindrance. There were even many who took the initiative to intermarry with demons and monsters, hoping that their descendants would be born with extraordinary abilities. This was actually walking on the old path of the non-human and alien species, and this was the problem. This method seemed to be faster and more beneficial, and it did not require any external objects. In addition, after the decline of the Tao, the upper echelons of the Eastern Barren Continent were slightly at a loss for what to do, and their reliance on the mystic cultivators of the lower echelons increased. Therefore, they were unable to restrain these people for the time being, causing this trend to quickly spread in the Eastern Barren Continent. Because of this, the elder was worried that after tens of thousands of years, there would be no living beings among the living. When the Tao flourished again in the future, even if they reincarnated, they would not be human, and then they might not be able to walk on the original path of the Tao. Wei Zihong laughed and said, "Elder Mo, you don't have to worry about this. How could the feudal vassals of the Eastern Barren Continent be so unwise? If the people down below all have the blood of demons and aliens, how could they possibly rule over their people? Besides, although the Taoist cultivators have retreated, they have only retreated to places that contain spirits. They have not perished. If the demons and devils wish to take the place of the Tao, they won't just sit back and watch." Elder Mo sighed. "I'm just worried that some scheming people will play tricks behind the scenes. Now that we don't have the support of the Taoist magic, it will be very difficult for the rulers of the various nations to maintain order. Furthermore, the mountain and sea realm has more outsiders than living beings. If we aren't careful, the situation could become very difficult to deal with." As a cultivator, he understood that most upper realm cultivators did not care about mortals. Even if the Eastern Barren Continent was destroyed, it would not be able to keep up with his own longevity. However, as someone from the state of Shinfang, he had no choice but to find a way out. Wei Zihong thought about it for a moment. After all, the mountain and sea realm was the home of the various sects and clans, and the Eastern Barren Continent could not just ignore it. "Elder Mo's words make sense," he said. "In a moment, I will find some fellow Taoists to discuss this matter." In the devil-subduing Grand Hall of the Inata Temple, Zhang Zhen was currently flipping through the letters she had received over the past few days. After the grand competition, the various sects and clans of the mountain and sea realm had taken advantage of the situation to expand. They had established Taoist rite temples throughout the heavens and the myriad worlds. However, their momentum had been halted when the Taoist magic was cut off. Now, all of the sects and clans had retreated, and the Taoist rite temples were no longer in use. The Inata Temple was facing a similar situation. The elders of the sect were of the opinion that maintaining the lower houses of the various sects and clans was pointless. Therefore, they began to submit petitions in hopes of abandoning the lower houses and allowing the elders and disciples to return to the sect. After reading through the letters, Zhang Zhen looked at the elders and said, "We can't retreat. The Taoist magic has been cut off, and the wretched will flourish. This is the time for the Inata Temple to use its power." Hearing what she said, an elder's expression changed. He stood up and advised, "Sect Master, the Taoist magic has been cut off. If one of our disciples dies, we will have one less. We can't make up for it anymore. If we use it to fight against the demons and the wretched, how long can we last? I'm afraid that it won't be long before all of our disciples die." Another elder stood up and advised, "Sect Master, it's not easy for the Inata temple to have what it is today. Now that all the sects have retreated, even if the Inata temple hibernates for a while, we won't be left behind. It's not worth it to do this." Zhang Zhen's gaze fell upon them, and all the elders unconsciously lowered their heads. However, she didn't reprimand them. She said, "It's reasonable for the elders to worry, but it's not impossible to solve this problem. Recently, I've deduced a method. With the help of an instrument, even if there's danger, we can still enter the Inata temple and minimize the loss of our disciples." The elder who spoke earlier hesitated and said, "But after all," Zhang Zhen said, "Elders, you don't have to worry about this. It's not only the disciples who will fight against the demons. You have to know that the instrument is also our method." In reality, if it wasn't necessary, she wouldn't let the disciples of the lower sects go out and risk their lives. Instead, she was prepared to let them create various instruments to fight against the demons and the wretched. In this way, the reputation of the Inata temple wouldn't decline due to the Taoist magic being cut off. Even if the disciples hid in the inner world, it wouldn't delay the matter. Every once in a while, the Taoist magic would be sent out. After the elders understood their sect master's intention, they discussed among themselves and felt that this method might work. It could protect the disciples and maintain the current situation of the Inata temple. If the Taoist magic were to return in the future, there would be great benefits. Therefore, they didn't advise anymore and expressed their willingness to follow the arrangement. Zhang Zhen said, "Elders, please go and make arrangements in the various realms. I expect that once the sects retreat, the demons that were suppressed will rise again. We need to suppress them as soon as possible. After that, it'll be easier to deal with them." Outside the Bushu heaven, in a world that was created before their departure, Bai Wei and Deng Zhang sat on cattail hassock. They were looking at the chaotic scene of the heavens and realms. Bai Wei saw that after the Taoist magic was declining, the demons and the wretched were not affected. Instead, they flourished because of the spiritual vigor. He couldn't help but exclaim, "I didn't expect the path of Tao to be cut off for no reason. Instead, it's us who benefit." Deng Zhang said in a low voice, "If this situation can't be changed, it's still okay in this era. But in the next era, humanity will definitely decline." Bai Wei nodded and said, "The Bushu Heavens Tao originally had a saying of the fate of 3 eras. Looking at this situation, it proves this saying." He pondered for a while and said, "But even if humanity declines, as long as the few Yuanzun are still around, they'll still be able to suppress me." Deng Zhang said slowly, "Previously, I signed an agreement with humanity to determine the ownership of the primordial jade with the disciples of each sect. It might be difficult to win in the beginning, but when the disciples of humanity reach the end of their lifespan, it would be difficult for them to fight with us." Bai Wei agreed, thinking about the collision of the positive and negative heaven and earth, the appearance of the 3 extraterrestrial demons, and even the agreement we signed with humanity. Everything happened before the Taoist magic was cut off. Now that I think about it, it's not fate. Chapter 2141. Beneath the abyss of the mountain and sea realm, Sima Quan was walking down a flight of stone steps filled with talisman carvings. This was the secluded palace platform built by the 6 sections. It was used to hide and suppress the strange creatures and objects found in the abyss. Along the way, he met many junior disciples of the 6 sects who were stationed here. All of them had normal expressions on their faces, which was very different from the other sects who were panicking and uneasy. This was because although the Tao technique had been severed, the impact on the 6 sects of the spirit sect was not as great as imagined. This was because the disciples of the spiritual sect could steal the spirits of devils and fuse them into their own bodies. However, if they were attacked by too much yin energy, they could easily walk the path of evil. Therefore, in the past, if it was not for the fact that cultivators had poor aptitudes, no one would choose to do such a thing. But now, they had no choice but to go back to the old ways. At this moment, his footsteps came to a halt. In front of him were two wide and thick stone doors blocking his way. The two disciples guarding the doors bowed and opened the doors for him. They said respectfully, "Elder Sima, please come this way." Sima Quan stepped inside and walked down a spiral stone staircase. Soon, he arrived at a grand underground palace. He saw Xue Dingyuan, the sect master of the Yuan Mirage sect, and Su Muqing, the sect master of the Blood Soul sect, waiting there. He cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, Sect Master Xue, Sect Master Su." Both of them returned the greeting. Xue Dingyuan said, "I've invited Elder Sima here today for the long-term plans of the spiritual sect." Sima Quan replied, "As expected." Su Muqing said, "Sect Master Yuan has already gone into seclusion. Within the spiritual sect, Sect Master Xue and Elder Sima have the highest achievements. Although I've discussed it with Sect Master Xue, there are still some issues that need to be resolved. I'll need Elder Sima's help here." Xue Dingyuan took a few steps forward and said, "Elder Sima, please look over here." Sima Quan looked over and saw that there were 21 cages covered in dense yin energy. He could tell at a glance that they were all heavenly demons. Xue Dingyuan said, "These are the heavenly demons that our 6 sects have captured from the depths of the earth abyss over the past several thousand years. They're currently being suppressed here." He turned around and said, "We were thinking, if these heavenly demons can be used by us, then not only the junior disciples, but even the superior cultivators can also find a way out." Sima Quan understood and said, "Are the two of you afraid that this heavenly demon is hard to tame and will secretly cause trouble again?" Xue Dingyuan said, "I do have this concern, but as long as I can force these heavenly demons to sign a contract with me and ensure that one of their clones is not destroyed, they will naturally be able to adapt to the circumstances. I invited Elder Sima Quan here because I want you to be the final lock." Su Muqing said, "The heavenly demon's cloudy yin energy is especially strong, so it's not easy to stabilize it. After I've refined it, there will inevitably be mistakes, and I'm afraid that these will be used by external enemies. Therefore, I can only invite Elder Sima here to see if you can stabilize it." Sima Quan pondered for a while and said, "This method can be done, but I also hope that the two of you will stop here. If it's only the heavenly demon, I can still guarantee that nothing will go wrong, but the Genin demon is not so easy to handle. If it's not done well, it will easily bring chaos to the world." Xue Dingyuan and Su Muqing looked at each other and said, "We can promise you this, Elder Sima." At this moment, Sima Quan looked below and said, "Speaking of the Genin demon, as the spiritual vigor continues to rise, I'm afraid that more will be born. I'm afraid that the prohibition that our 6 sects have worked together to set up in the past will need to be repaired." Guan Liangzhou, Han Xiu Cloud Cave, where the Pingdu sect's monastery was located. The hierarch, Nitianping, stood on the jade platform inside. Ever since the grand competition, he returned to the monastery with the power of achieving mortal metamorphosis and firmly suppressed the conservative faction. Initially, he planned to be free from the shackles of the hidden appearance spiritual tower. Just when he was full of ambition, he did not expect the world's Tao to be cut off. In this case, he had to rely on the hidden appearance spiritual tower instead. This was because with the tower spirit, the disciples of the Pingdu sect could borrow its power even if they did not cultivate Qi path and only used secret techniques. It was just that the cultivation here was slower, and it was not easy to reach the upper state. Now, the conservative faction that he had painstakingly suppressed had once again raised their heads. Not only could he not stop them, but he had to support them instead. Footsteps were heard behind him, and a middle-aged Taoist walked over with majestic gait. He cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, Hierarch. Elder Gu is here." Nitianping turned around and said politely, "Take a seat and talk." Elder Gu could tell that he was a person who did not care about trifles. He rolled up his sleeves and waved his hands. "Hierarch, I will not be sitting. This time, I have chosen more than 1,000 disciples, and all of them have contracted with the Dharma spirits. This way, even if there are losses in the future, as long as the Dharma spirits are not lost, there will be replacements. Ni Tianping nodded. Thank you for your hard work, Elder Gu. Elder Gu said with a straight face, it's not hard at all. I just hope that you will not interfere with the matters of your subordinates this time. Ni Tianping shook his head. I am not a pedantic person. As long as it is beneficial to the sect, I will do it. Now that only the tower spirit can protect the Pingda's sect just now, I will naturally rely on it. Elder Gu seemed to be relieved. That's good. I was worried that you would be stubborn and not allow others to speak. I will go now. He cupped his hands and walked out excitedly. Ni Tianping said behind him, Elder Gu, when the Dharma returns in the future, I will also do what a hierarch should do. I hope you can understand the logic behind this. Elder Gu paused, then waved his sleeves. If that is the case, it is still up to hierarch to decide. He turned around and left with the sound of flying through the air. To the west of the western desolate domain, on a wasteland that was tens of thousands of miles away, more than 100,000 heavenly ghosts were cutting mountains and building altars. These heavenly ghosts came from different tribes, and after being disrupted, they were sent here. Under the watch of many cultivators, the tribes did not have any strange thoughts. After all, they had lived like this for thousands of years and were long used to being enslaved by the sections. But recently, some of the elders of the heavenly ghosts noticed that something was wrong. Over the past 6 months, the number of cultivators guarding them had gradually decreased. 30 days ago, the last 2 cultivators left in a hurry after handing over most of the matters here to them. At first, the heavenly ghosts did not dare to act rashly because these cultivators had done something similar in the past, deliberately giving them a chance to rebel so that they could slaughter them justifiably. But as the days passed, the cultivators showed no signs of returning, causing many of the heavenly ghosts to become restless. A few elders gathered together boldly, thinking that something must have happened behind the scenes of the Taoist cultivation sections. The first thing they thought of was to escape, for the chances of success were very high. This place was desolate, and the cultivators would never waste their time and energy on a few heavenly ghosts. One of the elders suddenly said, "Why don't you leave with the tribe?" The other elders looked at each other, and someone said, "Elder Ing Huang, how can we escape with the tribe?" Elder Ing Huang showed a disdainful look and said, "This place is very far from the western desolate region, and there are countless ferocious beasts around here. Even if we are born with divine abilities, how can 1 or 2 of us fight against these ferocious beasts? So what if we don't do that?" Another elder said indignantly. "If the cultivators return, we will be the ones to be slaughtered." Elder Ing Huang said with certainty, "These cultivators will not return." The elders of the heavenly ghosts were very surprised, not understanding why he was so sure. Elder Ing Huang said in a deep voice, "I have an innate divine ability that can sense the heart. A few days ago, I sensed that these cultivators were in a panic, and they were in a hurry to leave. I guessed that something big had happened in their sects, and since they haven't returned for so long, their sects might have already been destroyed." The elders were shocked and doubtful. They were following a group of itinerant cultivators who were preparing to establish a sect in a remote place, and it was said that they had borrowed a magical boat from a large sect to transport them here. They were not strong, so it was possible that they were suddenly destroyed or dispersed due to internal strife. An elder asked, "But even so, where can we go with so many of us?" Elder Ing Huang said in a firm tone, "Continue to the west. Rumor has it that the ancestral tribe obtained an item that fell from the heavens in the west, and that was how they were able to build the Heavenly King City." At this point, he stood up, and his eyes lit up. "If the ancestral tribe blesses us, we can also find something similar, and we might be able to reclaim our former glory." Zhang Yan sat in the hall and sensed inside and outside, paying attention to every ripple of qi activity in Jizhuang Doran's direction. In order not to alarm him, he did not observe or calculate in depth, and only relied on his senses. Ever since the Tao was cut off, the living beings in this world were in a much more difficult situation than before. Although it was also greatly beneficial for the living beings to bathe in the spiritual aura due to the prosperity of qi activity, it was still not as good as the ferocious and strange creatures. He had seen many living beings in this world being destroyed before they could find a way to deal with the demons. After sitting and observing for a year, he finally discovered some clues in one of the worlds. The living beings here only had to worship a certain ghost god, and after a long period of time, they would naturally obtain the power to move mountains and shake mountains. If that was all, it would be normal. Some of the evil spirits who had cultivated for a long time could do that, but due to the limited power of these evil spirits, it was impossible for every believer to respond to them. This ghost god was different. Whether it was sincere worship or perfunctory worship, everyone could respond to it. There was also an extremely complicated ritual, and the more the people followed the rules when they worshipped, the more power they could obtain. Therefore, sincerity was secondary. However, he did not observe for long before the ritual lost its effect, and the people naturally gave up on this method. Until the collapse of this world, nothing similar happened. Logically speaking, he could be said to have watched countless of the worlds at the same time, and there were countless strange things happening. This was just an insignificant matter, and not worthy of much attention. However, the problem was, when he was suspicious of Ji Zhuang's purpose, he had observed something similar in the void. It could only be a coincidence that this happened in one of the worlds, but for it to happen in two places consecutively, there must be a mighty person behind it. However, there was no sign of Ji Zhuang's qi activity seeping into this place, so he could not be completely sure that it was done by him, and he had to continue observing. However, after that, he did not see anything similar. Only he knew that as long as the other party did not give up, he would definitely reveal his tracks, so he waited patiently. After sitting for another 10 years, one day, his heart suddenly skipped a beat. He opened his eyes and looked at a certain place in the modern world. Chapter 2142. This time, what Zhang Yan saw was very different from the last two times. Instead of a group of living people, he saw a group of demons. The demons were all in human form, prostrating themselves in worship of a greater demon. Although the person they were worshipping was different, and the ritual they used was different from what he had seen before, it was fundamentally the same. So, it really is him, he thought. By now, he was sure that this was what Zhizhuang Daoren was doing. It also confirmed his suspicions that severing the Taoist magic to prevent that entity from returning had not been his true goal. Everything he had done had been to make a big deal out of it. However, the demons in human form were a bit strange. In the past, most high-grade Taoists had been human cultivators. That was because the human body was the most suitable form for Taoist cultivation. However, after the Taoist magic was severed, there was no need for demons to assume human form. Therefore, such a method seemed unnecessary. Furthermore, Ji Zhuang could easily come up with a set of rules that would make it easier for the demons to prostrate themselves in worship. In fact, he could even use a different method, which would make it less likely that he would reveal himself. After a moment's thought, he came to a conclusion. Although Tao techniques were extinct now, that was only done by the Lotus of Good Fortune. What was broken was only a minor Tao. The true Tao actually did not change much. Even deity refinement cultivators could be considered as people who pursued Tao. They were also pursuing Tao themselves, so how could there be any change? The human form was the most compatible with the fundamental nature of the great Tao. That was why it had been the easiest for living people to reach the higher realms. Although outsiders and demons were innately powerful, few were able to pluck high-grade Tao fruits. From what he could tell, none of the fellow Taoists he had encountered were demons. From that, it seemed that Zhizhuang Daoren had a profound reason for doing this. Although the method seemed simple, it actually led to a great Tao. As for who the ritual was worshipping, it didn't matter. Whether it was an immortal or a devil god, it was all for the sake of helping living beings pass the test of understanding, and then guiding them to assume human form. Once they passed the initial stage, they would be able to control the more complicated ritual. The various sects and clans of the mountain and sea realm used all sorts of magical techniques to give their disciples of the younger generation divine abilities and magical power. However, they were all minor Taos. Although they could live forever, and could wield powerful divine abilities, such methods were completely unrelated to the great Tao. If Ji Zhuang's method were to be passed down and spread throughout the worlds, it would very likely fill the gap left behind by the retreat of Tao laws. He wasn't sure what Ji Zhuang wanted to do, but from these traces and his own senses, he was sure that it had something to do with him finding his Weili. Thus, he had to find a way to delay this matter. From what had happened to Creation Pauline, he could tell that once she regained her power, she would no longer speak nicely to you. Instead, she would use force to oppress you. However, it was not appropriate to obstruct him on the surface, so he should fight against him on Tao techniques. After a moment's thought, he decided that it would be best to create a magical incantation that he could release into the world of mortals to be cultivated. Originally, he had created a technique that didn't require any external objects to cultivate. However, it wasn't a complete technique. Before coming to the mountain and sea realm, he had only created it up to the meridian opening stage. If cultivators followed this technique, then they would have to continue on the Tao of energy. Therefore, it couldn't be considered a true Taoist magic. Later, he had created a new technique, but at that time, his cultivation base was insufficient. At the most, the technique had reached the heavenly passage stage, and was unable to advance any further. Therefore, he hadn't been able to truly use it. Furthermore, the descent of good fortune Pauline's Weili had also cut it off. However, he could still create a new technique. It only took a single thought for him to create a new magical incantation that was many times more profound than the one he had created before. However, he still felt that it was lacking something, which meant that it must be flawed. But then again, having flaws was actually a good thing. That way, Zhizhuang Daoren wouldn't pay too much attention to it. Furthermore, he could always make up for the flaws in it in the future. With that thought in mind, he willed a huge rock to appear in front of him. As he watched, numerous runes began to appear on the surface of the rock. The rock trembled, then shattered into countless fragments that scattered throughout the heavens. As for whether or not Zhizhuang Daoren would use good fortune Pauline to sever this Taoist magic, he didn't think it was very likely. This was because he, the heavenly chariot Lord Busu, was trying to implement a new technique in his own territory. It didn't involve the other worlds, so there was no reason for anyone to interfere. Furthermore, if someone dared to do so, then he would incite the Weili in Busu's heavenly chariot lands, as well as the other good fortune lands, and call upon all of his fellow Taoists to fight back. In that case, the previous agreement would be completely overturned. It wasn't hard for Ji Zhuang to predict that this would happen. He was a man who abided by the rules, and wouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture because of a small mistake. Having done all of that, he continued to sit in the hall, paying attention to any changes that might occur in the desolation. However, it was at this point that he suddenly sensed something, and couldn't help but smile. Not long after, Zhang Chan entered the hall from outside. He was very happy as he bowed and said, "Greetings, old master." When I heard old master's call, I immediately came over. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You go to Zihong's place for a while. Tell him that I know what he's up to. Tell him to be at ease and act boldly. There's no need to worry too much. Once you're there, you can stay by his side and work for him." With that, Zhang Chan excitedly made his way to the mountain and sea realm. In the Yaoyin clan, after Wei Zihong received the report from his subordinate, he took it very seriously. There was an urgent reason why the Eastern Wastelands was so popular with the demons and outsiders. Over the past thousands of years, the Taoist cultivators and the mystic cultivators had joined forces to hunt them down. Although the demons and outsiders had retreated into the depths of the wastelands, that was because the Tao had enough power to suppress them. If the outsiders knew that the Taoist magic had declined, and that the cultivators had left the world, the Tao would no longer be able to suppress them, and they would most likely make a comeback. There was no need to talk about anything else. The Yaoyin clan was already showing signs of this. A few days ago, a few demonic cultivators from the lower sect had spread the news that the Taoist magic had been severed to the clan, and they had already been executed by the sect. He laughed coldly. These demonic cultivators had always been well behaved, but now that the situation had changed, they immediately had their own ideas. He didn't know whether to call them stupid or ignorant. Did they really think that the Taoist magic had been severed, that the cultivators would have no more methods to deal with them? In his opinion, he had to ruthlessly suppress the idea that the demonic cultivators had just now. It seems I can use the method I came up with earlier, he thought. Before stepping into the mortal shedding process, he had cultivated the myriad origins transformation art, which had been passed down to him by Patriarch Tai Heng. It was a technique that used the blood of a true dragon to cultivate. After he had severed his mortal shedding, his understanding of the technique deepened. If the blood of a true dragon could be used by humans, then the blood of a demon or devil could also be used, although the effects would be different. If he could create a technique that could steal the quintessence of the demons and devils and use it for himself, then not only would he be able to keep the outsiders in check, but he would also be able to benefit the Tao. Ever since the grand competition of the mountain and sea realm, the connection between the heavens and the myriad realms had grown more frequent. His vision was no longer focused on the mountain and sea realm, but rather, on the Tao. Therefore, according to his plan, this technique would not only be used within the mountain and sea realm, but would also be used throughout the heavens and the myriad realms. At the same time, he would be able to spread the name of the Bright Nether bloodline, and even the Yaoyin clan. However, this was a very important matter, especially since there were so many outsiders in the myriad realms. It would be difficult for him to take care of all of them by himself. The best thing to do would be to find other members of his sect to study the technique together, and then discuss it with the sect leaders of the various sections. While he was trying to figure out the technique, a disciple came to report that Zhang Chan was requesting an audience. Knowing that Zhang Chan wouldn't be fine, he immediately said, "Invite him in." As soon as Zhang Chan entered, he clasped his hands and said, "Greetings, elder brother Wei." Wei Zihong returned the greeting with a smile. "Aren't you practicing cultivation on the heavenly star? I've heard that you're quite free and unfettered. What brings you to my place?" Zhang Chan said, "I'm here on orders from my master to deliver a message." Wei Zihong's expression immediately turned serious. "What message does master have for me?" Zhang Chan said, "Master says that if you have something you need to do, you can do it boldly. There's no need to have any misgivings. I'll stay here to help you, elder brother." Wei Zihong's spirits rose. So this was all within master's expectations. With master's protection, I can do as I please. In the southernmost part of the eastern wastelands, in the sea-sinking mountains. More than 10 large clans lived here, led by the Gao, Qing, and He clans. There were roughly 1 million of them, which was quite a large population in such a remote area. These people were not natives of the Eastern Baron. Their ancestors were people from the 9 cities of the Qinsang school. However, they were chased out because they made a mistake. Back then, there were not just 1 or 2 people who were chased out, but several clans. After this generation was chased out, because they could not stay near the northern cold abyss, nor could they join any mountain sea sect, they chose to migrate to the Eastern Baron. They knew some breathing techniques, and exchanged their savings for cultivation techniques from some small sections. For thousands of years, there would occasionally be 1 or 2 grand cultivators, and they could be considered to have gained a foothold in the Southern Baron. However, as their cultivation techniques were cut off, these large clans began to feel uneasy. The seaside was not like the inland of the Eastern Baron. There were all kinds of demonic fishes and demonic birds. They could still fight against this generation of people who were proficient in cultivation techniques, but what about the next generation? Wouldn't they only be food for the demons? Just as the upper echelons of the various clans were worried, the fishermen fished out some broken stones from the sea. They looked like they had fallen from a cliff somewhere, but they were covered with strange characters. The bow of the boat felt that they were extraordinary, so it was brought back to the clan. After all, the ancestors of the various clans were from the 9 cities, so they were also knowledgeable. At a glance, they recognized that it was an erosion rune. They suspected that it was related to the great sects of the 9 continents, so they ordered people to fish again. After half a year, they fished out hundreds of fragments, and finally put them together to form a stone tablet that was about 10 feet tall. What was strange was that after this object was put together, it would repair the damage on its own, and finally become one. The upper echelons of the various clans believed that this object was extraordinary, and they even looked for people who understood erosion runes to decipher it. However, there was no result. Over time, they lost interest in it, and no longer paid attention to it. For more than 10 years, there was no movement from this object, and it was gradually forgotten. Until one day, a group of children went to play behind the mountain. One of them, surnamed Gao, lost his way and was separated from the others. Unknowingly, he walked in front of a cave. At this time, it happened to be sunrise. He saw light coming out of the cave, and out of curiosity, he walked in.